They were brothers in blood, united against the greatest empire the world had ever seen. When the Persian hordes darkened the skies with arrows at Thermopylae and Plataea, Athens and Sparta stood shoulder to shoulder. Together, they saved Western civilization itself. But within a single generation, these saviours of Greece would tear each other apart in a war so savage, so total, that it would consume everything they fought to protect. This is not a story of heroes. This is a story of hubris, plague, and betrayal, of 40,000 men abandoned in a foreign land, left to die of thirst or be sold into slavery, of entire populations executed, of allies switching sides like pawns on a blood-soaked chessboard. For 27 years, the Greek world burned. The greatest democracy ever conceived faced off against the most feared military machine in human history, and when the dust settled, Greece itself lay broken, never to rise to such heights again. What you're about to witness is the brutal truth of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict where strategy meant starving civilians, where honour died in plague-ridden streets, and where the very men who saved Greece from Persia condemned it to ruin. This is the story of how Athens, the jewel of the ancient world, fell from unmatched glory into utter devastation. This is the war that changed everything. If you're ready to experience the raw, unfiltered reality of ancient warfare, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Wars in History. Ring the notification bell because this is going to be a journey through one of the most brutal conflicts in human history, and you won't want to miss a single moment. The year is 431 BC. The world stands on the edge of catastrophe, though few realise it yet. Greece, a collection of fiercely independent city-states scattered across the Aegean, has just defeated the impossible. 50 years earlier, the Persian Empire, stretching from Egypt to India, sent wave after wave of armies to subjugate the fractious Greeks. They failed. Against all odds, the combined forces of Greek city-states repelled the greatest military power on earth. And at the heart of that miracle stood two cities, Athens and Sparta. The Persian threat had been real and terrifying. In 490 BC at Marathon, 10,000 Athenian hoplites charged across the plain against a Persian force twice their size, breaking the centre of the Persian line and driving the invaders back to their ships. It was Athens' finest hour, proof that Greek courage and discipline could defeat Eastern despotism. But the Persians returned, and in far greater force. 10 years later, King Xerxes led the largest army the world had ever seen into Greece. Ancient sources claimed millions, though modern scholars estimate perhaps 200,000 soldiers supported by a fleet of 600 warships. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas held the narrow pass for 3 days against the entire Persian army, buying time for Greek cities to evacuate and prepare defences. When a Greek traitor showed the Persians a mountain path around the pass, Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek forces and fought to the death with his Spartans and a few allies, every man falling where he stood. Their sacrifice became legend, the ultimate expression of Spartan devotion to duty and contempt for death. Athens evacuated entirely, its citizens fleeing to Salamis and the Peloponnese, while Persian forces burned the city and desecrated the temples on the Acropolis. But Themistocles, the architect of Athens' naval power, had convinced Athens to invest its silver from the Laurian mines into building a fleet of 200 triremes. At Salamis, in the narrow waters between the island and the mainland, that fleet destroyed the Persian navy. Xerxes, watching from a throne on the shore, saw his fleet shattered, his elite ships rammed and sunk by Athenian seamanship. Without naval support, his massive land army could not be supplied. He retreated, leaving behind a substantial force under his general Mardonius. The final confrontation came in 479 BC at Plataea. 30,000 Greek hoplites, the largest allied force ever assembled, met the Persian army in central Greece. Sparta led the Greek right wing, Athens the left. When the Persians finally attacked, the Spartans advanced in perfect formation, their shields locked, spears levelled, an irresistible wave of bronze and iron. They shattered the Persian centre, killing Mardonius himself. Athens simultaneously routed the Persians on the other flank. The victory was complete. Persia would never again threaten mainland Greece. Those victories at Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis and Plataea forged the legend of Greek invincibility and Athenian Spartan brotherhood. They were the saviours of civilization, the defenders of freedom against tyranny, but that brotherhood, born in shared sacrifice, would not survive the peace that followed. Athens emerged from the Persian wars transformed. The city that once cowered behind wooden walls now commanded the most formidable navy the Mediterranean had ever seen. The Delian League, originally formed to protect Greek cities from Persian revenge, had evolved into something far more ambitious, an Athenian empire. Tribute flowed into Athens from hundreds of subject cities. The Parthenon rose on the Acropolis, a monument not just to the gods but to Athenian supremacy. Democracy flourished within its walls. Philosophy and theatre reached heights never before imagined. Pericles, the architect of this golden age, declared Athens the school of Hellas, a beacon of culture and power that would endure forever. But empires built on the tribute of others rarely inspire love, and Athens' rapid ascent bred resentment across Greece. Sparta represented everything Athens was not. Where Athens embraced democracy, commerce and culture, Sparta forged itself into a weapon. From birth, Spartan males belonged to the state. At age 7, they entered the brutal Agog training system, designed to strip away weakness and forge warriors of legendary prowess. Spartan hoplites were feared throughout Greece, their crimson cloaks and lambda shields synonymous with military perfection. But Sparta's power came with a terrible price. The Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, numbered only a few thousand, yet they dominated hundreds of thousands of helots, state-owned slaves who worked the land and lived under constant threat of violence. The entire Spartan system existed in perpetual fear of helot rebellion, making Sparta inherently conservative, suspicious of change, and terrified of any external power that might inspire their slaves to revolt. The tension between these two powers was inevitable. Thucydides, the Athenian general and historian who chronicled this war, identified the root cause with clarity that still resonates today. The growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta made war inevitable. This was not merely a clash of armies, but of ideologies, economic systems, and incompatible visions for Greek supremacy. Athens, secure behind its long walls connecting the city to its port at Piraeus, believed its naval dominance made it untouchable. Sparta, with the most feared land army in Greece, saw Athens' growing empire as an existential threat that would eventually encircle and strangle the Peloponnesian League. The immediate triggers came swiftly. In 433 BC, Athens formed an alliance with Corcyra, a powerful naval state embroiled in conflict with Corinth, Sparta's most important ally. The following year, Athens issued the Megarian Decree, imposing crippling economic sanctions on Megara, another Spartan ally, effectively blockading their ports and strangling their economy. Corinth, furious at Athens' intervention and fearful of further Athenian expansion, demanded Sparta take action. Sparta issued an ultimatum: revoke the Megarian decree or face war. Pericles, at the height of his influence, convinced the Athenian assembly to refuse. To back down, he argued, would signal weakness and invite further demands. Athens would negotiate only as equals, never as subordinates. In the spring of 431 BC, diplomacy died. Thebes, a Spartan ally, launched a surprise attack on Plataea, an Athenian ally. The assault failed, but the message was clear. War had begun. The Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta and including most of the powerful states of southern Greece, mobilized against the Athenian Empire and its subject allies scattered across the Aegean. The stage was set for a conflict of unprecedented scale and savagery. This would not be a war of single battles and quick resolutions. It would be a grinding, brutal contest that would consume 2 generations, devastate entire populations, and fundamentally alter the course of Western civilization. Pericles presented Athens with a strategy that seemed counterintuitive, but militarily sound. Sparta's army was invincible in open battle, so Athens would not face them in the field. Instead, the rural population of Attica would abandon their farms and retreat behind Athens' impregnable walls. Let the Spartans burn the crops and ravage the countryside. Athens, connected to the sea by the long walls and sustained by tribute from its empire and imported grain, could endure indefinitely. Meanwhile, Athenian triremes would raid the Peloponnesian coast, strangling Spartan allies economically and demonstrating that Sparta could not protect its own. It was a war of attrition, one that would test not military courage, but economic endurance and political will. Pericles believed Athens had both in abundance. He was wrong. What neither side anticipated was that this war would become a crucible of unprecedented horror. It would see plague reduce Athens to a charnel house, where corpses piled in the streets and social order collapsed into anarchy. It would witness betrayals that seemed unthinkable, with brilliant commanders switching sides and advising their former enemies. Entire cities would be besieged, starved and annihilated. Tens of thousands would die not in glorious battle but in desperate, futile attempts to escape across hostile terrain, hunted down and slaughtered or enslaved. The Peloponnesian War would prove that civilized Greeks could commit atrocities rivaling any barbarian horde when survival and supremacy were at stake. This is the story of that war, a tragedy in 4 acts, where each decision led inexorably to greater catastrophe, where pride and ambition blinded even the wisest leaders to the abyss opening before them. Act 1 will show you the spark that ignited the inferno. Act 2 reveals the strategic genius of Sparta's unexpected champion. Act 3 descends into the Sicilian nightmare, where Athens' greatest expedition became its greatest disaster. And Act 4 chronicles the slow, agonizing fall of the city that believed itself eternal. By the end, you will understand how the saviors of Greece became its destroyers, and why the Peloponnesian War remains one of the most important cautionary tales in human history. Before the first Spartan hoplite crossed into Attica in 431 BC, 50 years of tension had been building between Athens and Sparta. This period, called the Pentacontatia by Thucydides, was the crucible where Athenian imperialism was forged and Spartan fear took root. To understand why the war became inevitable, you must understand how Athens transformed from Sparta's grateful ally into its existential threat. In 478 BC, with Persian forces expelled from mainland Greece but still controlling Asia Minor, representatives from Greek cities met on the sacred island of Delos. They formed the Delian League, a defensive alliance to protect against Persian return and liberate Greek cities still under Persian control. Athens, with the largest navy in Greece, naturally assumed leadership. Each member contributed either ships or tribute to fund the common defence. It was voluntary, it was democratic, and within a decade it became an empire. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. When Naxos attempted to withdraw from the League in 470 BC, Athens besieged the island and forced it back into membership. The precedent was set: you could not leave the alliance. When Thasos revolted in 465 BC over a trade dispute, Athens crushed the rebellion, tore down Thasos's walls, confiscated its fleet, and imposed crushing tribute payments. The Delian League was no longer an alliance of equals. It was an empire ruled from Athens, and tribute was no longer a contribution, but a tax enforced by overwhelming naval power. The treasury itself moved from Delos to Athens in 454 BC, ostensibly for safekeeping, but actually to give Athens direct control over the accumulated wealth. Pericles redirected League funds to rebuild Athens, constructing the Parthenon and the Propylaea, with money contributed by allies for defence against Persia. It was magnificent. It was also theft, and every Greek city paying tribute knew it. The Parthenon that tourists admire today was built with what amounted to imperial plunder, proof of Athenian power and Athenian arrogance in equal measure. Sparta watched this transformation with growing alarm. After the Helot revolt of the 460s, when Sparta's enslaved population nearly overthrew their masters, Athens had sent 4,000 hoplites to help suppress the rebellion. But Sparta, paranoid about foreign influence inspiring their slaves, dismissed the Athenian force and sent them home. It was a calculated insult that severed the alliance forged in the Persian Wars. From that moment, Athens and Sparta were rivals, and every Athenian gain in power seemed to Sparta like an Athenian threat to their survival. The First Peloponnesian War erupted in 460 BC, a 15-year conflict that ended in stalemate and the 30 Years' Peace of 446 BC. That treaty established spheres of influence. Athens would dominate the sea and the Aegean, Sparta would control the Peloponnese, and both would respect each other's alliances. It lasted barely half its intended duration, because neither side could reconcile their fundamental incompatibility. Athens was dynamic, expansionist, driven by democratic assembly votes that could shift policy overnight. Sparta was conservative, defensive, terrified that any change might trigger Helot rebellion and destroy their entire social system. The peace held for 14 years, but underneath the pressure built. Athens established colonies, extended its influence into the Black Sea grain trade, collected tribute from hundreds of cities. Sparta watched its alliance system fray as members looked enviously at Athenian wealth and power. By 431 BC, the situation was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and when that spark came, in the form of Corcyra and the Megarian decree, neither side could step back from the abyss. The saviours of Greece were about to destroy each other, and 50 years of accumulated fear, resentment, and imperial ambition ensured that when the war began, it would consume everything. To understand the war that was about to begin, you must understand the weapon that made Athens a superpower: the trireme. These warships were technological marvels, the most sophisticated military hardware of the ancient world. A trireme was approximately 40 meters long and 5 meters wide, propelled by 170 rowers arranged in 3 tiers on each side. The name trireme comes from this 3-level arrangement: threnite rowers on the top tier, zygite rowers in the middle, and thalamite rowers on the bottom, closest to the waterline. Rowing a trireme required extraordinary coordination. The rowers sat so close together their oars nearly touched. A single rower out of rhythm could foul the entire ship's stroke. The Thalamite rowers, working just above the waterline, faced the most dangerous position. If the ship was holed or rammed, they drowned first, trapped below deck with water pouring in through the oar ports. Yet when properly crewed and commanded, a trireme could reach speeds of 9 knots, turn within its own length, and ram enemy vessels with a bronze-sheathed bow that could shatter hulls and send ships to the bottom in minutes. Athens maintained a fleet of 300 triremes at the war's beginning, each requiring a crew of 200 men. This meant Athens needed 60,000 trained men to crew its fleet at full strength. The rowers were primarily citizens and metics, resident aliens, drawn from the poorest classes who could not afford hoplite armour. Naval service gave them political power, and they used that power to support radical democracy and aggressive imperial policies. The trireme's dominance came with crippling costs. Each ship required constant maintenance. They could not remain at sea for extended periods and needed to beach each night. A campaign season's naval operations could drain the treasury even without battles. The rowers needed daily pay, typically 1 drachma per man per day, meaning a fleet of 100 ships cost 17,000 drachmas daily just for wages. But the investment produced unmatched military capability. Athens could strike anywhere in the Aegean within days, and as long as the fleet controlled the sea, no land army could starve Athens into submission. The Spartan king Archidamus II did not want this war. A veteran commander and friend of Pericles, he understood what others refused to see, that this would not be a simple conflict of spears and shields. But duty demanded obedience, and in the summer of 431 BC, Archidamus led the largest Peloponnesian army assembled in a generation across the borders of Attica. 40,000 hoplites marched behind him, a forest of spears that could crush any Greek army foolish enough to face them in open battle. They expected the Athenians to emerge from their walls, to defend their farms and vineyards, to fight with the honour tradition demanded. Instead, they found the countryside abandoned. Pericles' strategy was already in motion. Every man, woman and child from the Attic countryside had retreated behind Athens' walls. Families abandoned ancestral homes their grandfathers built, left crops ripening in fields, livestock wandering unattended. They watched from the walls as Spartan torches ignited their farms, as smoke rose from burning orchards that had stood for generations. The rage was palpable, visceral. Young Athenian hoplites demanded to march out and fight. Pericles refused. Athens would endure behind its walls, sustained by its empire and naval supremacy, while Sparta exhausted itself ravaging empty fields. But what Pericles could not control was the consequence of cramming tens of thousands of refugees into a city designed for far fewer. The plague arrived in 430 BC, slipping into Athens through Piraeus like a silent assassin. Within days, it transformed the city into a nightmare beyond anything the Spartans could inflict. Thucydides, who survived the disease himself, documented its horror with clinical precision. It began with violent fever and inflammation of the eyes, then descended into the throat and chest. Victims coughed blood, their bodies convulsed, skin erupted in pustules and ulcers. The suffering was unbearable, driving people mad with thirst as they threw themselves into cisterns seeking relief. Death came between 7 and 9 days after the first symptoms, though some lingered longer in agony. The corpses piled faster than they could be burned. Traditional burial rites collapsed. Bodies lay rotting in the streets. Desperate survivors threw their own dead onto funeral pyres meant for others, caring nothing for custom or decency. But the true devastation was not merely physical. The plague shattered the social fabric of Athens itself. Law and order disintegrated as people realized wealth and virtue offered no protection from death. Why honor the gods when temples filled with corpses of those who sought divine sanctuary? Why obey laws when tomorrow might never come? Debauchery replaced discipline. Theft became commonplace. Men spent their fortunes on immediate pleasures, convinced they would not live to see another month. The democracy that Athens prided itself on, the culture Pericles celebrated as the school of Hellas, descended into chaos. Approximately 1/3 of Athens' population died in successive waves of plague that struck in 430, 429, and 427 BC. Among the dead was Pericles himself, the architect of Athenian strategy, the man who promised they could endure anything Sparta threw at them. The overcrowding that welcomed the plague was itself a crisis. Athens, designed for perhaps 40,000 residents, now held triple that number as refugees from all across Attica crammed into every available space. Families built makeshift shelters between buildings. The long walls became a continuous shantytown. Sanitation collapsed. Wells became contaminated. The conditions were perfect for epidemic disease. When the plague struck, it moved through the crowded city like fire through dry timber. Physicians died attempting to treat patients. The rich died as frequently as the poor. Thucydides noted that the disease struck hardest those with the strongest constitutions, young men in their prime. This inverted mortality pattern added to the terror. The psychological impact matched the physical devastation. Athenians had always believed that divine favour rewarded virtue. The plague destroyed that certainty. The pious who sacrificed to the gods died screaming. The dissolute sometimes survived. If the gods would not protect the righteous, why maintain righteousness? The social contract evaporated. Funeral rites became impossible to maintain. Bodies were supposed to be washed, mourned properly, and cremated with appropriate rituals. But when dozens died daily, there was no time for ritual. Families stole others' funeral pyres. Bodies were left in temples, the sick dying atop corpses of those who preceded them. If such blasphemy produced no divine punishment, perhaps the gods were indifferent or absent. Pericles himself succumbed in autumn 429 BC. The man who had guided Athens for 3 decades, who had built the Parthenon and convinced Athens it could endure anything, died in the same epidemic that was proving his strategy's fatal flaw. Before he died, weakened by fever, he supposedly clutched an amulet, a superstitious charm completely at odds with his rational reputation. His death left Athens leaderless when visionary leadership was most desperately needed. Pericles died in 429 BC, leaving Athens leaderless at the worst possible moment. Into the void stepped men of far lesser vision. Cleon the Tanner, a demagogue who understood how to manipulate the assembly's rage better than how to wage war effectively. His counterpart in Sparta was Brasidas, but where Cleon trafficked in rhetoric, Brasidas proved himself a military genius of unprecedented boldness. The contrast between Athens' new leadership and its former greatness became brutally clear in the Mytilenean affair of 427 BC. When Mytilene, one of Athens' most privileged allies, revolted and sought Spartan support, Athens responded with savage fury. After crushing the rebellion, Cleon convinced the assembly to execute every adult male in Mytilene and enslave all women and children. A trireme sailed with orders to carry out the massacre. The next day, horror replaced rage. The assembly reconvened, appalled at what they had ordered. A second ship departed, its rowers desperate to overtake the first. They rowed day and night, eating as they pulled the oars, in a race against genocide. They arrived just hours after the first ship, preventing the slaughter. Athens ultimately executed only the ringleaders, about 1,000 men, and confiscated Mytilene's fleet. But the debate itself, preserved by Thucydides, revealed how the war was transforming Athens. The city that once claimed moral superiority now argued not about justice but about which atrocity would prove more strategically useful. The measured wisdom of Pericles had given way to the crude calculus of terror and expediency. While Athens debated genocide in the Mytilenean affair, something far worse was unfolding on the island of Corcyra. What happened there in 427 BC revealed how the Peloponnesian War wasn't just destroying armies and cities, it was destroying the very concept of civilization itself. Thucydides devoted significant portions of his history to the Corcyraean civil war because he recognized it as the moment when Greek society crossed a moral threshold from which there would be no return. Corcyra had allied with Athens in 433 BC, one of the triggers of the war. But the island was divided between democratic and oligarchic factions, and when Corinth captured Corcyraean prisoners in a naval battle, they sent them back to Corcyra with instructions: overthrow the democracy and bring Corcyra over to Sparta's side. What followed was stasis, the Greek term for civil war, but a word that carried connotations far beyond mere political conflict. Stasis was the breakdown of all social bonds, the moment when neighbour turned against neighbour, and every rule that held society together dissolved into blood. The democratic faction struck first, assassinating oligarchic leaders during a council meeting. The oligarchs fled to defensive positions in the hills and among the temples. Fighting erupted throughout the city. Slaves were armed and promised freedom if they fought for their masters' factions. Women threw roof tiles from buildings onto enemy fighters below. The sacred boundaries of temples, which for centuries had protected suppliants from violence, were violated as men were dragged from altars and executed. Prisoners were locked in a building that was then set on fire, the screams of burning men echoing through streets running with blood. An Athenian fleet arrived to support the Democrats. A Peloponnesian fleet came to aid the oligarchs, but neither could control the violence they had helped unleash. When the Democrats finally gained the upper hand, they didn't just defeat their opponents, they exterminated them. Oligarchs who surrendered were promised trials, then executed without process. Men who sought sanctuary in temples were starved or tricked into leaving, then killed. Families were destroyed, brothers killed brothers, fathers denounced sons. Every personal grudge, every old slight, every property dispute became grounds for murder under the cover of political affiliation. Thucydides described how language itself was corrupted during the stasis. Reckless aggression was called courage. Prudent hesitation became cowardice. Moderation was a mask for weakness. Violence was virtue. The bonds that held Greek civilization together, respect for oaths, honour to guests, reverence for the gods, loyalty to family, all dissolved. Men competed to see who could commit the most extreme atrocities, not from hatred, but from the sheer momentum of violence feeding on itself. Society didn't just collapse, it inverted, turning every civilized value into its opposite. Approximately 1,500 men died in the Corcyraean stasis, a small fraction of the war's total casualties but a significant portion of Corcyra's citizen population. More importantly, Corcyra became the template. Stasis spread across the Greek world like plague, city after city tearing itself apart along democratic and oligarchic lines, with Athens and Sparta encouraging the slaughter as long as their preferred faction won. The war that began as a conflict between two visions of Greek supremacy had degenerated into something far more primal, the complete breakdown of the social contract, the end of the rules that made civilized life possible. Thucydides wrote about Corcyra because he understood that this was what war did when it continued too long. It didn't just kill people, it killed the very idea of humanity itself. Yet Athens could still achieve stunning victories when competent commanders held sway. In 425 BC, the general Demosthenes fortified Pylos, a rocky promontory in Spartan-controlled territory on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese. Sparta, panicked at an Athenian foothold so close to Helot territories, responded with overwhelming force. They landed 420 elite hoplites on the nearby island of Sphacteria to blockade the Athenian position from the sea. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Athenian triremes arrived, defeated the Spartan fleet, and trapped those 420 hoplites on Sphacteria without supplies or hope of rescue. Sparta, terrified of losing so many full citizens, immediately sued for peace. They offered extraordinarily generous terms. Athens, urged on by Cleon, refused. The siege of Sphacteria dragged on for months. Sparta smuggled food to the trapped men by sending divers underwater with wineskins filled with honey and poppy seeds. Desperate helots earned their freedom by braving Athenian blockades to deliver supplies. Finally, Demosthenes and Cleon landed on the island with a force that included light-armed troops and archers. An accidental fire burned away the vegetation that had sheltered the Spartans, exposing their positions. What followed shocked the Greek world. Faced with being shot down by arrows and javelins from enemies they could not reach, with their commanders dead or wounded, the surviving Spartans surrendered. Nearly 300 Spartan citizens laid down their arms rather than die fighting. The unthinkable had happened. Spartans, legendary for their willingness to die before surrendering, chose captivity. Athens paraded the prisoners through the city and imprisoned them, holding Sparta's own citizens as hostages against further invasions of Attica. Sparta's humiliation at Sphacteria was answered by their own unexpected champion. Brasidas was not a typical Spartan commander. Where others were cautious and conservative, he was audacious and charismatic. In 424 BC, he led a small force of only 700 helots and 1,000 Peloponnesian mercenaries north into Thrace, deep into Athenian-controlled territory. His mission seemed impossible: detach Athens' northern allies and sever their access to timber and precious metals. But Brasidas possessed something few Spartans had: the ability to inspire through words as well as deeds. He convinced city after city to revolt, promising liberation from Athenian tyranny, offering reasonable terms, and backing his words with brilliant tactical strikes. Acanthus, Stagirus, and most importantly Amphipolis, a strategically vital city commanding gold mines and timber resources, fell to him not through prolonged siege, but through persuasion and swift, decisive action. Athens sent Thucydides himself serving as a general to relieve Amphipolis. He arrived too late. The city had already surrendered to Brasidas, earning Thucydides exile from Athens for 20 years, and providing him the time to write his masterwork chronicling this war. Athens dispatched Cleon with a larger force to reclaim the lost territories. The two champions of their respective sides met at Amphipolis in 422 BC. Brasidas, though outnumbered, lured Cleon into a trap. As the Athenians attempted to retreat from their reconnaissance of the city, Brasidas launched a sudden assault from Amphipolis's gates. The Athenian formation shattered. Cleon died fleeing the field, killed by a javelin in his back. Brasidas fell in the moment of victory, mortally wounded, leading his men forward. He lived just long enough to learn he had won, then died. Amphipolis honoured him as their founder, erasing all the memory of their Athenian origins. The deaths of Cleon and Brasidas, the most war-hungry leaders on both sides, opened the door to peace. Sparta desperately needed the return of the prisoners from Sphacteria, whose families represented the core of Spartan society. Athens, bloodied in Thrace and exhausted by plague, needed respite to consolidate its empire. The resulting Peace of Nicias, signed in 421 BC, was supposed to last 50 years. It mandated the return of prisoners, the restoration of captured territories, and the cessation of hostilities between Athens and Sparta and their respective allies. On parchment, it looked like a genuine resolution. In reality, it was a fragile illusion built on foundations of mistrust, unresolved grievances, and territorial disputes that neither side had the will to truly settle. The treaty's flaws became apparent immediately. Sparta could not compel its allies, particularly Corinth and Thebes, to accept the terms. Key cities like Amphipolis refused to return to Athenian control, and Sparta lacked the means to force them. Athens, meanwhile, held on to Pylos, maintaining a dagger pointed at Sparta's heartland and a beacon for Helot rebellions. The 50-year peace lasted barely 6 years before open warfare resumed, and even during those 6 years, neither side truly stood down. Proxy conflicts continued, alliances shifted. Both Athens and Sparta manoeuvred for advantage, preparing for the inevitable resumption of the war they both knew was coming. The plague had killed 1/3 of Athens' population. The first decade of war had cost tens of thousands of lives, devastated the Attic countryside, shattered alliances, and brutalized both sides. Yet nothing had been resolved. The fundamental question remained unanswered. Who would dominate Greece? The Peace of Nicias was not peace but an intermission, a chance to sharpen blades and nurse grudges before the next, even more catastrophic act began. The men who would shape that next phase were already moving into position. In Sparta, a new generation of commanders studied Brasidas' methods and prepared to finish what he started. In Athens, a brilliant, charismatic, utterly immoral aristocrat named ALCIBIADES was ascending to prominence, a man whose ambition would prove more dangerous to Athens than any Spartan army. The saviours of Greece had tasted each other's blood and found they wanted more. The spark had ignited the flame. Soon that flame would become an inferno that would consume everything in its path. The Peace of Nicias was dying before the ink on the treaty dried. In the grand amphitheatre of Greek politics, neither Athens nor Sparta could compel their allies to honour terms those allies had never agreed to accept. Corinth, still seething over Athenian interference in its sphere of influence, refused to ratify the peace. Thebes followed suit. Most critically, the northern cities that Brasidas had convinced to revolt, particularly Amphipolis, flatly rejected Athenian demands for their return. Sparta, bound by treaty to restore these cities, found itself impotent to enforce compliance. The result was a peace that existed only on parchment, a diplomatic fiction that fooled no one and satisfied nothing. Into this unstable equilibrium stepped a man who would reshape the war's trajectory through sheer force of personality and unbridled ambition. Alcibiades was everything Athens admired and everything it should have feared. Born into one of Athens' most distinguished families, blessed with extraordinary beauty, intelligence and charisma, he commanded attention wherever he went. He had studied under Socrates himself, absorbing philosophical brilliance while apparently learning nothing about humility or restraint. Alcibiades lived extravagantly, scandalously, winning chariot races at Olympia and flaunting his wealth in ways that both dazzled and offended democratic sensibilities. He was a political genius who understood how to manipulate the Athenian assembly better than anyone since Pericles. But where Pericles had served Athens' interests, Alcibiades served primarily his own, and he saw the fragile peace not as an opportunity for recovery, but as a canvas for his ambitions. Alcibiades recognized that the peace of Nicias had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Greece, but not in Athens' favour. Sparta, chastened by the disaster at Sphacteria, and desperate to recover its citizens held hostage in Athens, had signed the treaty from a position of weakness. But weakness was temporary. Already Sparta was manoeuvring to isolate Athens by constructing a new network of alliances in the Peloponnese. The most dangerous development came in 418 BC, when Sparta faced a coalition of Argos, Mantinea, and Athens itself at the Battle of Mantinea. This was the largest land battle of the entire Peloponnesian War, a clash of nearly 20,000 hoplites that would determine whether Sparta's military reputation could survive its humiliation at Sphacteria. King Agis II of Sparta commanded the Spartan forces with approximately 9,000 men, including 3,500 full Spartan citizens, the largest concentration of Spartiates fielded in decades. Against them stood an alliance of Argives, Mantineans and Athenians numbering roughly similar strength. For Sparta, this battle was existential. A defeat would shatter the myth of Spartan invincibility that had kept the Peloponnesian League together for generations. It would encourage Helot rebellions and embolden Athens to expand its influence throughout southern Greece. The stakes could not have been higher, and initially, Agis nearly lost everything. His tactical manoeuvres before the battle were so questionable that his own officers openly refused his orders, an unthinkable breach of Spartan discipline. But when the phalanxes finally collided, Spartan training and discipline reasserted themselves with devastating effect. The Spartan right wing, as was customary in hoplite warfare, drifted rightward during the advance, overlapping the enemy left. The Spartan left found itself outnumbered and outflanked. Agis, attempting to compensate, ordered units from his right to shift left and fill the gap, but in the chaos of battle the orders went unexecuted or misunderstood. The Spartan left collapsed under Mantinean pressure. The centre bent dangerously. For a moment, total defeat loomed. Then the Spartan right wing, having crushed the Athenian forces opposite them, wheeled inward with mechanical precision. The discipline that defined Sparta, the years of a gauge training that turned men into components of a single organism, manifested in that critical moment. The Spartans reformed, attacked the enemy centre and right from multiple directions, and turned near defeat into comprehensive victory. The Allied forces broke and fled. Spartan losses were minimal. Enemy casualties exceeded 1,000. Mantinea restored Sparta's reputation and demonstrated that despite Sphacteria, Spartan hoplites remained the finest heavy infantry in Greece. More importantly, it shattered the anti-Spartan coalition in the Peloponnese before it could mature into a genuine threat. Argos, the only city with the population and resources to potentially rival Sparta in southern Greece, was forced into an alliance with Sparta. Athens gained nothing from the battle except dead citizens and the sobering realization that Spartan power on land remained unchallengeable. For Alcibiades, who had orchestrated Athens' involvement in the anti-Spartan coalition, Mantinea represented a political setback. He needed a new strategy, a bold move that would restore his prestige and expand Athenian power beyond Sparta's reach. Alcibiades' defection to Sparta was not merely a betrayal, it was strategic catastrophe. He possessed comprehensive knowledge of Athenian plans, defensive capabilities, and political weaknesses. In Sparta, he advised King Agis on exactly how to cripple Athens most effectively. His first recommendation was to fortify Deceleia, a small town in northern Attica just 24 kilometers from Athens. This permanent fort allowed Spartan forces to raid Attic territory year-round, not just during summer campaign seasons. 20,000 slaves, primarily from the Laurian silver mines, fled to Deceleia seeking freedom, collapsing Athens' primary source of precious metal. Farmers could no longer work their fields safely. Athens became completely dependent on imported grain, making it vulnerable to any disruption of Black Sea trade routes. Alcibiades' second recommendation was even more damaging. Sparta must build a fleet and challenge Athens at sea. This contradicted everything in Spartan military tradition, but Alcibiades explained that Persian gold could fund construction and crew wages, and that Athens' subject allies were restive and ready to revolt if they saw Spartan ships in their waters. He was correct on all counts. Spartan navarchs, admirals, soon commanded squadrons in the Aegean, and Athenian allies began defecting en masse. But Alcibiades' greatest betrayal was personal as well as strategic. While in Sparta, he seduced Queen Timea, wife of King Agis. When Timea bore a son, rumours spread that Alcibiades, not Agis, was the father. Alcibiades reportedly boasted that he did this to ensure his bloodline would sit on the Spartan throne. Whether the rumour was true or not, it made Alcibiades' position in Sparta untenable. Agis wanted him dead. In 412 BC, Alcibiades fled again, this time to Persia, where he offered his services to the satrap Tissaphernes. Once again, the most brilliant strategic mind of his generation was available to the highest bidder, and once again Athens would suffer for the enmity of a man they had exiled. His eyes turned westward, toward Sicily. In 416 BCC, between the Battle of Mantinea and the Sicilian Expedition, Athens committed an atrocity that Thucydides immortalized not through description of the violence, but through a philosophical dialogue that laid bare the brutal logic of empire. The island of Melos, a Spartan colony that had remained neutral throughout the war, became the victim of Athenian strategic calculation. What happened to Melos revealed that Athens, the city that claimed to be the school of Hellas and the birthplace of democracy, had become exactly what it had once fought against, a tyranny that ruled through naked force. The Athenians arrived at Melos with overwhelming military force. 38 ships carrying hoplites and support troops. They didn't immediately attack. Instead, they sent envoys to negotiate with the Melian leadership. What followed was the Melian dialogue, one of the most famous passages in all of Thucydides, a conversation where Athens abandoned all pretense of justice and argued purely from power. The Melians opened by appealing to fairness and self-interest. They had remained neutral, threatening neither Athens nor Sparta. To attack them would be unjust and would turn other neutral states against Athens. The Athenian response was brutally honest. Justice is irrelevant between unequals. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Athens didn't need to justify its actions through moral arguments. Power was its own justification. The Melians argued that the gods would protect them because their cause was just. The Athenians countered that the gods, like men, rule wherever they have the power to do so. Divine favour follows strength, not righteousness. The Melians pointed out that Sparta would come to their aid, bound by kinship and honour. The Athenians laughed at this naivety. Sparta would do what served Spartan interests, nothing more. Honour was a luxury that only the strong could afford, and Melos was weak. Every Melian argument, appeals to mercy, to precedent, to the risk that Athenian brutality would inspire resistance elsewhere, was systematically demolished by Athenian logic. The dialogue wasn't a negotiation. It was Athens explaining to Melos why resistance was futile and why Melos's destruction was a mathematical certainty. The Athenians offered simple terms: submit to Athenian control, pay tribute and survive, refuse and be destroyed. There would be no middle ground. The Melians, clinging to hope that transcended reason, refused. They believed that fortune, the gods, or Spartan intervention would save them. They were wrong on all counts. Athens besieged Melos, and when the city finally fell after months of starvation, the Athenians executed every adult male they captured and enslaved all the women and children. The island was then colonized by Athenian settlers. Melos ceased to exist as an independent entity. Its population scattered into slavery, its culture erased. The destruction of Melos achieved no strategic objective. The island posed no threat to Athens. Its subjugation added minimal resources to the Athenian empire. But Melos served a purpose beyond strategy. It was a demonstration of will, a message to every city contemplating neutrality or resistance. Athens had become an empire that ruled through terror, and Melos was the proof that no appeal to justice, mercy, or divine intervention would stay the Athenian hand. Thucydides placed the Melian dialogue immediately before his account of the Sicilian Expedition, and the juxtaposition was deliberate. The same Athens that coldly explained to Melos that the strong do what they can would sail to Sicily driven by ambition that exceeded capacity. The logic that justified destroying Melos, that power creates its own justification, would be tested in Sicily, and Athens would discover that empires built on naked force eventually encounter forces they cannot overcome. The city that executed the men of Melos would see its own men executed in Syracuse. The empire that believed power made everything permissible would learn that power, when overextended, becomes weakness. Melos was Athens at its most honest and most monstrous. It was the moment when the saviour of Greece at Marathon revealed itself to be indistinguishable from the Persian tyranny it had once defeated. And it was the omen that should have warned Athens that hubris invites nemesis, that empires built on terror eventually collapse under the weight of their own cruelty. Sicily was a glittering prize. The island was rich in grain, timber, and wealth, home to numerous Greek colonies that had flourished far from the conflicts consuming mainland Greece. The most powerful of these was Syracuse, a city that rivaled Athens itself in population, naval strength, and ambition. Syracuse dominated eastern Sicily and harboured imperial aspirations of its own. Various smaller Sicilian cities, caught between Syracuse's expansion and their own rivalries, periodically appealed to Athens for protection. In 415 BC, the city of Segesta made just such an appeal, claiming they were threatened by Silenus, a Syracusan ally, and promising to fund an Athenian expedition with vast treasures. It was a transparent attempt to draw Athens into Sicilian politics, but Alcibiades seized upon it as the opportunity he needed. Before the Athenian assembly, Alcibiades painted a vision of boundless conquest. Sicily would be only the beginning. Once Athens controlled the island's resources, they could move against Carthage in North Africa, then dominate the entire western Mediterranean. With Sicily's wealth and manpower, Athens would become invincible, capable of crushing Sparta at leisure while ruling an empire spanning from the Black Sea to the Pillars of Heracles. The younger citizens of Athens, who had never experienced the horrors of the plague or the grinding brutality of the war's first decade, listened with mounting excitement. Here was glory, wealth, and empire for the taking, Here was the destiny that Athens deserved. Nicias, now the most prominent voice for caution in Athens, rose to oppose the madness. Nicias was everything Alcibiades was not: cautious, pious, conservative, and fundamentally defensive in his strategic thinking. He had negotiated the peace that bore his name precisely because he understood that Athens was overstretched, its population still recovering from plague, its treasury strained by years of war. Nicias argued that Sicily was a distraction from the real threat. Sparta was not defeated, merely delayed. The peace of Nicias was already fraying. Athens' empire faced restiveness from subject cities resentful of Athenian tribute and control. To launch a massive expedition across the Mediterranean while these fundamental problems remained unresolved was strategic insanity. Better to consolidate what Athens held, rebuild its strength, and prepare for the inevitable resumption of war with Sparta. The assembly was unmoved by Nicias's logic. Alcibiades had captured their imagination with visions of empire and glory. Desperate, Nicias changed tactics. In a catastrophic miscalculation, he argued that if Athens was determined to attack Sicily, it could only succeed with an overwhelming force. He demanded not 60 ships but more than 100, not 3,000 hoplites but 5,000, along with vast numbers of support troops, transports and supplies. Nicias intended this astronomical price tag to shock the assembly into abandoning the expedition. Instead, his ploy backfired spectacularly. If even the famously cautious Nicias believed Sicily could be conquered with sufficient force, then surely it was achievable. The assembly enthusiastically voted to provide everything Nicias requested and more. What might have been a limited operation with acceptable risks became an expedition so large that its failure would be catastrophic. Athens mobilized the greatest armada in its history, 134 triremes filled with 5,100 hoplites, 1,300 light infantry and hundreds of archers and support personnel. Supply ships, cavalry transports and auxiliary vessels swelled the fleet to well over 200 ships. Nearly half of Athens' entire military-age male population would sail to Sicily. The cost was staggering, draining the treasury that Athens had accumulated over decades of imperial tribute. But the spectacle was magnificent. In June 415 BC, the fleet gathered in Piraeus, a forest of masts and oars stretching beyond sight. Families gathered to see off fathers, sons and brothers. Priests performed sacrifices. Trumpets sounded. In perfect formation, the greatest expeditionary force the Greek world had ever seen departed for Sicily, propelled by hubris, ambition, and the conviction that Athens' destiny was to rule the Mediterranean. Then, the night before the fleet sailed, something happened that should have stopped everything. Across Athens, the Hermae, sacred stone pillars topped with the head of Hermes and featuring a phallus, were systematically mutilated. These were not random acts of vandalism. The Hermae stood throughout the city, protecting homes, marking boundaries, blessing travellers. Their desecration was an assault on the gods themselves, an act of shocking impiety that terrified superstitious Athenians. Who would dare commit such sacrilege, and why, on the eve of the greatest expedition in Athenian history? Suspicion immediately fell on Alcibiades and his circle of aristocratic companions, known for their drunken irreverence and contempt for traditional religion. Political enemies accused Alcibiades directly, claiming the mutilation was part of a conspiracy to overthrow the democracy. Alcibiades demanded an immediate trial to clear his name before the fleet departed. He knew the charges were politically motivated, designed to remove him from command. But his enemies were cleverer than that. They argued that the expedition was too important to delay for a trial. Alcibiades should sail with the fleet as planned. The trial could wait until he returned, crowned with the glory of conquest. Reluctantly, Alcibiades agreed, not realizing he was walking into a trap. The fleet sailed under joint command. Alcibiades, the brilliant strategist and charismatic leader, Nicias, the cautious elder statesman who opposed the entire venture, and Lamachus, a competent but politically insignificant general. This divided command structure guaranteed friction and indecision at the worst possible moments. The expedition arrived in Sicily to discover that Segesta's promises of wealth were lies. The city possessed a fraction of the funds they had claimed, nowhere near enough to sustain the massive Athenian force. The generals convened to decide their next move. Lamachus, the only pure military man among them, advocated the obvious strategy: immediate assault on Syracuse. The city was unprepared, its defences incomplete, its forces scattered. A swift, decisive strike might take Syracuse before it could organise resistance. But Lamachus commanded no political authority, and his opinion counted for little. Alcibiades proposed a more cautious approach. Spend time building alliances among other Sicilian cities. Isolate Syracuse diplomatically. Then strike from a position of overwhelming advantage. Nicias, incredibly, advocated doing almost nothing. Make a show of force to satisfy Segesta's request, then return to Athens having demonstrated Athenian power without committing to a major campaign. Before they could resolve these strategic contradictions, the state trireme Salaminia arrived from Athens with orders to arrest Alcibiades and several other officers on charges of mutilating the Hermae and profaning the Eleusinian mysteries. The trial Alcibiades had demanded before sailing would now proceed, but in his absence, orchestrated by enemies who had spent months gathering dubious testimony and inflaming public opinion. Alcibiades recognized a death sentence when he saw one. He told the Salaminia's crew he would follow them back to Athens in his own ship. Then, at the first opportunity, he fled. He escaped to the Peloponnese, made contact with Sparta, and offered his services to Athens' mortal enemy. In Athens, he was tried in absentia, convicted, sentenced to death, and his property was confiscated. The man who had conceived the Sicilian expedition was now a traitor, and he was about to prove himself the most dangerous traitor Athens had ever created. Alcibiades arrived in Sparta with an offer no Spartan could refuse. He knew Athens' strategy, its weaknesses, its fears. He knew exactly how to defeat the expedition he had championed, and exactly how to cripple Athens itself. Before the Spartan assembly, Alcibiades outlined a two-pronged strategy of devastating simplicity. First, send military aid to Syracuse immediately. The Athenians in Sicily were paralysed by divided command and unclear objectives. A relatively small Spartan force with a competent commander could stiffen Syracusan resistance and turn what should be an Athenian victory into a grinding siege. Second, and far more critically, fortify Decilia. Decilia was a rocky prominence in northern Attica, only 14 miles from Athens itself. No Spartan force had ever held territory so close to Athens on a permanent basis. Previous Spartan invasions had been seasonal raids, arrive in spring, ravage the countryside, depart before winter. But a permanent fortification at Decilia would transform the strategic situation entirely. From Decilia, Spartan forces could patrol Attica year-round, preventing Athenians from working their fields or accessing their silver mines at Laurium. More devastatingly, Decilia sat astride the land routes from Euboea, forcing Athens to import all supplies by sea at vastly greater expense. Every slave in Attica would have a place to run for freedom. Athens would be under constant siege in its own territory, while simultaneously trying to sustain a massive expedition across the Mediterranean. The Spartans, traditionally conservative and slow to embrace new strategies, recognized the brilliance of Alcibiades' plan. They dispatched Gylippus, an experienced commander, to Syracuse with a small force of Spartan officers and Peloponnesian troops. More importantly, in 413 BC, King Agis himself led an army to Deceleia, fortified it, and established a permanent garrison. For the first time in the war, Spartans would spend winter in enemy territory, maintaining relentless pressure on Athens. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Thucydides, ever precise in his observations, recorded that more than 20,000 slaves, many of them skilled craftsmen essential to Athens' economy, escaped to Deceleia. The silver mines that had funded Athens' navy fell silent. Every bite of food, every piece of timber, every necessity of life had to be imported by sea and unloaded at Piraeus under constant threat of interdiction. Meanwhile, in Sicily, the situation was deteriorating into nightmare. With Alcibiades gone and Nicias in command, the Athenian expedition lost all sense of strategic purpose. Nicias finally began the siege of Syracuse, but his natural caution and deteriorating health turned every decision into an agonizing delay. The Athenians established fortifications on the heights of Epipolae overlooking Syracuse, began building walls to encircle the city, and achieved some initial successes. Syracuse teetered on the brink of surrender. Then Gylippus arrived with Spartan reinforcements and everything changed. Gylippus was everything Nicias was not. Bold, decisive, and tactically brilliant. He rallied the Syracusans, broke through Athenian siege lines, and began constructing counter walls that prevented the Athenians from completing their encirclement. Nicias, watching his siege fail and his men dying of disease and skirmishes, wrote to Athens describing the disaster unfolding. The situation was critical. Athens must either recall the entire expedition or send massive reinforcements. Nicias also requested to be relieved of command, citing illness. The Athenian assembly, having already committed so much treasure and prestige to Sicily, could not accept failure. They voted to send reinforcements. 73 more ships carrying 5,000 additional hoplites and thousands of support troops under the command of Demosthenes and Eurymedon. Athens was doubling down, pouring more resources into an operation that was consuming men and money at a catastrophic rate while Sparta tightened its grip on Attica from Deceleia. The fundamental problem was that Athens was now fighting two wars simultaneously, and both were wars of attrition it could not win. In Sicily, the Athenians besieged Syracuse, while Syracuse, reinforced by Spartan expertise and growing support from other Sicilian cities, besieged the besiegers. In Attica, the Spartans from Deceleia besieged Athens itself, not with walls, but with constant raids and economic strangulation. Athens' strategy had always relied on its naval dominance and its imperial tribute, but naval dominance meant nothing when your army was trapped in Sicily and your own territory was occupied. The tribute from the empire was increasingly difficult to collect as subject cities sensed Athenian weakness and contemplated rebellion. The genius of the strategy Alcibiades had handed to Sparta lay in its elegance. Athens was not facing a single existential threat it could concentrate against. Instead, it was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, each manageable individually but collectively overwhelming. The expedition to Sicily had not been defeated in battle. It had been neutralized by competent opposition and trapped in an unwinnable siege. Athens itself had not been conquered. It had been slowly strangled economically and strategically. And the man who designed this catastrophe was the same man who had convinced Athens to sail to Sicily in the first place. Alcibiades had become Sparta's most valuable asset, not because he fought for them, but because he thought for them. He understood Athens in ways no Spartan could. He knew what Athenians feared, what motivated them, how they made decisions. He turned his intimate knowledge of Athenian psychology and strategy into weapons more devastating than any hoplite phalanx. The saviours of Greece were destroying each other, and the instrument of that destruction was a brilliant amoral Athenian aristocrat who served no cause except his own ambition and wounded pride. By the end of 414 BC, the war had entered a new and darker phase. The relatively limited conflicts of the ARCHIDAMIAN War, the tentative peace of Nicias, all of it seemed almost quaint compared to what was unfolding. Athens was committed beyond the point of rational withdrawal. To abandon Sicily would be to admit catastrophic strategic failure and invite rebellion throughout the empire. To continue in Sicily while Decilia bled Athens dry was to court total exhaustion. There was no good option remaining, only choices between different forms of disaster. And in Syracuse, 40,000 Athenian soldiers and sailors were about to discover that disaster could exceed even the darkest imaginings. While Athens bled itself in Sicily and Sparta fortified Decilia, a third player watched from the east with patient satisfaction. Persia, the empire that Athens and Sparta had united to defeat 70 years earlier, was about to re-enter Greek affairs as the kingmaker. The irony was exquisite. The two cities that had saved Greece from Persian conquest at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis would now compete for Persian favour, selling out the very freedom they had once fought to preserve. King Darius II ruled the Persian Empire from his palace at Susa, commanding territories that stretched from the Indus River to Egypt, from the steppes of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean. Greek city-states were insect squabbling in his western provinces, but useful insects if properly manipulated. For decades, Persia had demanded the return of the Ionian Greeks, the cities of Asia Minor that Athens had liberated after the Persian Wars. Athens had refused, maintaining that these Greeks would remain free. But now, with Athens desperate and Sparta ascendant, Persia sensed opportunity. The architect of Persian intervention was Tissaphernes, satrap of Lydia and Caria, one of the most powerful provincial governors in the empire. Tissaphernes was everything a Persian noble should be: educated, cultured, ruthless, and utterly pragmatic. He had watched the Greek war with the cold calculation of a master strategist. Let them bleed each other. Let their treasuries empty and their populations decline. And when they were sufficiently weakened, step in and reclaim what Persia had lost at Salamis. In 412 BC, shortly after news of the Sicilian disaster reached Greece, Tissaphernes made contact with Sparta. His proposal was elegant in its cynicism. Persia would provide Sparta with unlimited funding to build and maintain a fleet capable of challenging Athens at sea. Persian gold would pay the rowers, construct the ships, supply the provisions. Sparta, a land power that had never possessed significant naval capability, would suddenly command resources that could strangle Athens' maritime empire. The price was simple. Sparta would formally cede all Greek cities in Asia Minor to Persian control. The Ionian Greeks whom Athens and Sparta had fought to liberate would be returned to Persian slavery. For Sparta, this was a devil's bargain that required abandoning every principle they claimed to fight for. Sparta's propaganda throughout the war had been liberation, freeing Greek cities from Athenian tyranny, restoring autonomy to the oppressed. Now they would sell fellow Greeks to barbarian Persians for the silver needed to win. But Spartan leadership, pragmatic to the core, accepted immediately. Ideology was a luxury. Survival and victory were necessities. If betraying the Ionian Greeks meant defeating Athens, then the Ionians would be betrayed. The Treaty of Miletus, signed in 412 BC between Sparta and Tissaphernes, formalized the arrangement. Persia recognized Spartan claims to dominance in Greece proper. Sparta recognized Persian sovereignty over all territories the Persian king or his ancestors had ever controlled, a formula so broad it potentially included mainland Greece itself. For the moment, that ambiguity didn't matter. What mattered was that Persian silver began flowing to Spartan shipyards, and triremes that should have taken years to build began appearing in months. But Tissaphernes was playing a deeper game than Sparta realized. He had no intention of letting Sparta win decisively. A total Spartan victory would simply replace Athenian hegemony with Spartan hegemony, creating a unified Greek power that might eventually threaten Persia. Better to keep Athens and Sparta balanced, neither strong enough to dominate, both dependent on Persian goodwill. Tissaphernes provided just enough support to keep Sparta competitive, but not enough to deliver crushing victory. He delayed payments, withheld promised ships, and gradually reduced the daily wage for rowers from 1 drachma to 3 obols, a 50% cut that caused unrest in the Peloponnesian fleet. This strategy of calculated ambiguity became Persian policy for the war's final phase. Persia would back whichever side seemed weaker at any given moment, ensuring the conflict continued to drain both powers. And Persia had another tool, ALCIBIADES. The Athenian traitor, having fled Sparta after his affair with Queen Timaea, sought refuge with Tissaphernes in 412 BC. Alcibiades, ever the manipulator, convinced the satrap that his balanced strategy was wise. Keep the Greeks fighting, bleed them both. And when the time came, Persia could dictate terms to whoever survived. The presence of Persian power fundamentally altered the war's nature. What had begun as an ideological conflict between democracy and oligarchy, between naval and land power, between Athenian empire and Spartan liberation, became a sordid competition for barbarian patronage. Both Athens and Sparta, the saviours of Greece, debased themselves courting Persian favour. Ambassadors who once would have died before bowing to a Persian king now competed to offer the most abject submission in exchange for gold. Athens, learning of the Spartan-Persian alliance, desperately tried to counter it. Athenian envoys travelled to Tissaphernes offering their own bargain. Athens would cede Ionia to Persia in exchange for Persian support against Sparta. It was the final abandonment of principle. The city that had led the charge at Marathon, that had evacuated rather than submit to Xerxes, now offered to sell its allies for survival. Tissaphernes toyed with the Athenians, took their gifts, made vague promises, and delivered nothing. Why choose one side when playing both kept them weak? By 411 BC, Persian gold was the most valuable strategic resource in the Aegean. Cities switched allegiances based not on ideology, but on who could offer Persian backing. Athenian and Spartan commanders spent as much time courting Persian officials as fighting each other. The war that had begun with speeches about freedom and justice had degenerated into a mercenary scramble for foreign funding. And Persia, patient and calculating, watched the Greeks destroy each other, while preparing to reclaim territories lost a lifetime earlier. The Persian re-entry into Greek affairs was the war's most bitter irony. The alliance that had defeated Persia at Plataea had dissolved into rivals so desperate that they invited their former enemy back as arbiter. The freedom that Greeks had died for at Thermopylae was now bargaining material traded for tactical advantage. And the empire that had once threatened to enslave all of Greece would emerge from the Peloponnesian War as the dominant power in the Greek world, not through conquest but through the Greeks' own suicidal hatred for each other. The Athenian armada that arrived at Sicily in the summer of 415 BC represented the pinnacle of Athenian naval power and the embodiment of democratic ambition. 134 triremes carrying over 40,000 men stretched across the horizon as they approached the Sicilian coast. The sight should have terrified Syracuse. Instead, it revealed the first fatal flaw in Athens' grand strategy: divided command and absent clear objectives. Alcibiades wanted to build alliances first. Nicias wanted to complete a minor operation and return home. Lamachus, the only true soldier among them, advocated immediate assault on Syracuse while the city remained unprepared. They compromised, which in war often means choosing the worst possible option. The fleet spent precious weeks sailing between Sicilian cities, seeking allies, gathering intelligence, achieving nothing decisive. Syracuse watched, learned, and prepared. When the Athenians finally landed near Syracuse in late 415 BC, they won an initial skirmish easily. The Syracusan hoplites, untested and poorly organised, broke and fled when faced with Athenian discipline and experience. But the Athenian cavalry, vastly outnumbered by the Syracusan horsemen, prevented any pursuit or exploitation of the victory. This pattern would define the entire campaign. Athenian superiority in infantry warfare negated by Syracusan cavalry dominance, and increasingly by Athenian leadership failures. Then Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege, and everything began to unravel. His defection to Sparta was not merely a personal betrayal, but a strategic catastrophe. Alcibiades understood the Sicilian operations design better than anyone because he had designed it. He knew its weaknesses, its logistical vulnerabilities, its dependence on maintaining naval superiority and preventing Syracusan reinforcement. Now he would systematically dismantle his own creation from the safety of Sparta. The man who had promised Athens an empire from Sicily to Carthage became the architect of its greatest defeat. With Alcibiades gone, Nicias found himself effectively in command, though he shared nominal authority with Lamachus. Nicias was 58 years old, suffering from a kidney disease that caused him constant pain, and temperamentally unsuited for aggressive operations. He was pious to the point of superstition, cautious to the point of paralysis, and fundamentally believed the entire Sicilian venture was a mistake. Yet he could not bring himself to abandon it, perhaps from duty, perhaps from fear of how Athens would react to failure. So he proceeded with the siege of Syracuse half-heartedly, making decisions that were neither bold enough to win quickly, nor cautious enough to minimize risk. The siege strategy focused on Syracuse's geography. The city occupied a peninsula jutting into the sea, with the great harbour to the south providing a massive natural anchorage. North of the city rose the Epipolae Plateau, a limestone highland commanding the approaches to Syracuse. If Athens could fortify Epipolae and build walls extending from the plateau down to the great harbour in the south and to the sea in the north, they could encircle Syracuse completely, cutting it off from supplies and reinforcements. The city would starve or surrender. It was the classic Greek siege method. And in the summer of 414 BC, it nearly worked. The Athenians seized Epipolae in a daring dawn assault. 600 Syracusan defenders under Diomilus rushed to oppose them. In the brutal close-quarters fighting on the plateau, Diomilus and 300 of his men died. The rest fled. Athens now controlled the high ground. Athenian engineers began constructing a circular fort called the Circle, at the centre of Epipolae to serve as the anchor point for the siege walls. From the circle, construction crews worked day and night extending walls toward the sea to the north and toward the great harbour to the south. Syracusan morale collapsed. The city's leaders opened secret negotiations with Nicias about surrender terms. Syracuse teetered on the brink of capitulation. Then, in the autumn of 414 BC, everything changed. A single Corinthian trireme slipped through the Athenian blockade and landed at Syracuse carrying a Spartan commander named Gylippus and a small force of Peloponnesian soldiers. Gylippus was everything Nicias was not: decisive, aggressive, and tactically brilliant. He assessed Syracuse's situation instantly and recognized that the key to breaking the siege was Epipolae. Incredibly, despite controlling the plateau, the Athenians had failed to fortify or even guard the western approach to Epipolae at a pass called Euryalus. It was a staggering oversight, the kind of elementary mistake that dooms armies. Gylippus marched his forces up the undefended pass, joined with the Syracusan garrison on Epipolae, and suddenly Athens' stranglehold on Syracuse was broken. Gylippus immediately organised the construction of a counter-wall cutting across Epipolae perpendicular to the Athenian siege walls. If the Syracusan counter-wall reached beyond the Athenian lines, it would render the entire siege works useless, preventing Athens from completing the encirclement. The race was on. Athenian and Syracusan construction crews worked within sight of each other, both sides rushing to finish their walls first while their armies clashed in savage skirmishes around the construction sites. Laomachus, the competent general, led an attack to destroy the Syracusan counterwall. In the fighting, he was killed. Command now belonged solely to Nicias, a sick man who had never wanted this war, and who was increasingly overwhelmed by the situation spiralling beyond his control. The Syracusan counterwall reached beyond the Athenian lines. The siege, which had been days from success, was now broken. Worse, Gylippus captured the Athenian fort at Labdalum on the western edge of Epipolae, giving Syracuse complete control of the inland approaches. The strategic situation had reversed. Athens, the besieger, now found itself in a defensive posture, clinging to fortifications on Epipolae, while Syracuse, reinforced and revitalized under Spartan leadership, prepared to drive them out entirely. Nicias, faced with this deteriorating situation, did what he always did when confronted with difficult decisions. He procrastinated and wrote letters to Athens begging for guidance. Nicias's letter to the Athenian assembly in the winter of 414 to 413 BC is one of history's great documents of bureaucratic cowardice masquerading as candour. He laid out the dire situation in exhaustive detail. The army was worn down by disease and constant skirmishing. The ships, left in the water for months, were waterlogged and sluggish. Syracusan cavalry prevented foraging, forcing Athens to import all supplies at great expense. More enemy reinforcements were arriving from across Sicily and the Peloponnese. The initiative had shifted to the enemy. Nicias presented Athens with a choice: send massive reinforcements to salvage the operation, or recall the entire expedition and accept failure. What Nicias did not do was make a recommendation or assert his own judgment. He simply laid out the problem and demanded Athens solve it for him. The Athenian assembly, having already invested so much treasure and prestige in Sicily, could not accept withdrawal without total loss of face. They voted to send reinforcements on a scale that staggered even Nicias's request. 73 triremes carrying 5,000 hoplites, thousands of archers and light infantry, and additional cavalry, all under the joint command of Demosthenes and Eurymedon. The reinforcements represented Athens scraping together virtually every remaining military asset, not absolutely essential for home defence. With Sparta's garrison at Decelia strangling Attica and subject cities throughout the empire, watching for signs of Athenian weakness, Athens was committing resources it could not afford to lose to an operation that had already failed strategically. Demosthenes and Eurymedon arrived at Syracuse in the summer of 413 BC with their massive reinforcement fleet. For a brief moment, Athenian morale surged. The harbour filled with fresh ships, the camp swelled with eager soldiers who had not yet been ground down by months of frustration and disease. Demosthenes, the victor of Pylos who had trapped Spartan hoplites on Sphacteria, assessed the situation with a clear eye and reached an unambiguous conclusion: either take Syracuse immediately with an overwhelming assault, or abandon the entire operation and sail home while they still had the naval strength to break out. Remaining in a static siege that Athens was losing served no purpose except bleeding men and resources for no strategic gain. Demosthenes proposed a bold, desperate plan: a night assault on Epipolae to retake the high ground and destroy the Syracusan counterwalls. If successful, it would restore the siege and might still force Syracuse to surrender. If it failed, they would withdraw immediately. It was the kind of all-or-nothing gamble that situations like Syracuse demanded. Nicias characteristically hesitated but finally agreed. On a moonlit night, Demosthenes led 10,000 picked troops up the slopes of Epipolae in silence. Initially, everything went according to plan. The Athenians surprised the Syracusan outposts, overran them, and pushed forward to the counterwall. They began tearing down the fortifications. Victory seemed within reach. Then the night battle descended into chaos, as night battles inevitably do. Syracusan reinforcements rallied and counterattacked. In the darkness and confusion, Athenian units became disoriented. Friend became indistinguishable from foe. Men fought and killed their own comrades, unable to tell in the dim moonlight who was who. The watchword that should have identified fellow Athenians was overheard and used by the enemy to sow further confusion. Panic spread. What had been an advancing force became a disorganized mob desperately trying to retreat down unfamiliar terrain in darkness. Syracusan forces, fighting on familiar ground and reinforced by Gylippus' leadership, pursued ruthlessly. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a massacre. By dawn, the Athenian night assault had resulted in complete disaster. More than 2,000 men were dead or missing. The survivors straggled back to their fortifications exhausted, demoralized and traumatized. Demosthenes, watching the cream of his reinforcement force destroyed in a single night, immediately urged withdrawal. The operation had failed. Every day they remained in Sicily made the situation worse. They had to leave now, while they still had the ships and strength to force their way out of the great harbour and sail north to allied cities. Nicias, incredibly, refused. Nicias advanced multiple reasons for staying. The political situation in Syracuse might still turn in Athens' favour. He had secret correspondents in the city who hinted at pro-Athenian factions. Reinforcements might arrive from Athens' Sicilian allies. Most revealing of all Nicias' tortured logic, he feared that returning to Athens with such a catastrophic failure would result in his prosecution and execution. Better to die in Sicily than face an Athenian jury. So 40,000 Athenian soldiers and sailors remained trapped before Syracuse because their commander feared political consequences more than military annihilation. It was cowardice dressed as caution, and it doomed everyone under his command. The Syracusans, emboldened by their victory, and guided by Gylippus's strategic insight, recognized Athens' vulnerability. The Athenian fleet, though still numerically superior, was trapped in the great harbour. The ships had been in the water for nearly 2 years without proper maintenance. Hulls were fouled and waterlogged, making them sluggish and difficult to manoeuvre. Crews were depleted by disease and desertion. If Syracuse could defeat the Athenian navy, the army would be completely stranded, unable to escape, unable to be reinforced, doomed to eventual starvation or surrender. Syracuse began constructing a barrier across the narrow entrance to the great harbour. Sunken ships, pilings, and chains designed to trap the Athenian fleet inside. When Nicias finally realized what was happening, the strategic trap was nearly complete. The Athenians had to break out immediately, or be imprisoned in the great harbour indefinitely. But breaking out meant fighting a naval battle in confined waters where Athens' traditional advantages, superior seamanship and manoeuvrability, would be negated. The Syracusans had prepared specifically for close-quarters combat, reinforcing their ship bows with heavy timbers to serve as rams in the chaotic melee that fighting in the harbour would become. They had trained their crews for months. They had 76 triremes manned and ready. The Athenians had numerical superiority with more than 100 seaworthy ships, but numbers would mean less in the crushing confines of the great harbour. The naval battle that followed was unlike any in Greek history. Normally, trireme warfare was a contest of skill, ships circling and manoeuvring for position, seeking to ram enemy vessels in the vulnerable stern or shear off their oars with precisely executed passes. In the great harbour, there was no room for manoeuvre. The ships crashed together like mobs of infantry, grappling, ramming, boarding. Men fought hand-to-hand on crowded decks while ships splintered around them. The Syracusans' heavy reinforced bows smashed through Athenian hulls. Athenian ships collided with each other in the chaos. The noise was overwhelming, the crack of oars snapping, the screams of drowning men, the splinter of timber, the bellowing of officers trying to impose order on pandemonium. On shore, the entire Athenian army watched their navy fight for survival. Every man understood that if the fleet was destroyed, they were doomed. There would be no escape, no rescue, no hope. They cheered when Athenian ships gained advantage, groaned when ships sank or were captured. The battle raged for hours, ships churning the great harbour into blood-stained foam. Finally, the Athenian fleet broke. Not defeated in detail, but simply exhausted, overwhelmed, and unable to maintain coherence in the brutal close-quarters fighting. The surviving ships retreated to shore, their crews abandoning vessels too damaged to save. Syracuse had won the naval battle, and with it sealed Athens' fate. 70 Athenian triremes were destroyed or captured. The rest were too damaged to sail or defend the army. The barrier across the harbour's mouth held firm. Athens, the greatest naval power in Greece, had lost its fleet, and with it any possibility of escape by sea. 40,000 men were now trapped in Sicily with dwindling supplies, hostile forces surrounding them, and no possibility of relief. Nicias convened a council of the surviving generals. The conclusion was obvious and terrible. They were to abandon the ships, the siege works, everything they could not carry, and attempt to march overland to friendly territory. It would be a retreat through hostile land, harassed by cavalry with thousands of wounded and sick men slowing their progress. The chances of success were minimal, but there were no other options left. Nicias delayed the retreat for 3 days, struggling to gather supplies and organize the desperate march. The harbour of Syracuse became the killing ground where Athenian naval supremacy died. For Athens, accustomed to fighting in open waters where manoeuvrability dominated, the confined harbour was a nightmare. The Syracusans reinforced their ship bows with heavy timbers and adopted head-to-head ramming tactics. Athenian triremes, built for speed with slender bows, shattered when they collided with these reinforced Syracusan vessels. The harbour battles descended into brutal chaos. Ships couldn't manoeuvre properly, so they crashed bow to bow and became platforms for infantry combat. Marines poured missile fire into enemy ships at point-blank range. Men fought on blood-slick decks, fell overboard in armour and drowned, or were crushed between grinding hulls. The water turned red. Wreckage choked the harbour. Athenian rowers found their skills useless in this confined butchery. Precision rowing meant nothing when there was no room for complex manoeuvres. The Syracusans proved brutally effective in close-quarters harbour fighting. With each defeat, Athens lost not just ships but irreplaceable trained crews. Building new triremes took months. Training new rowers took years. Meanwhile, the land siege had stalemated. The Athenians lacked strength to tighten the noose. Supply became critical. Foraging parties faced cavalry ambushes. Supply ships from Athens took weeks to arrive and sometimes never came. The besiegers were slowly being besieged. Disease joined combat as Athens' enemy. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses swept through camps. The marshy ground bred mosquitoes. Contaminated water sickened thousands. Morale collapsed as men realized they were trapped in an unwinnable campaign, dying slowly from disease, hunger, and attrition thousands of kilometers from home. Nicias sent increasingly desperate messages begging for either massive reinforcements or permission to abandon the expedition. The assembly, unable to accept failure, sent reinforcements. Demosthenes arrived in summer 413 BC with 73 ships and thousands of fresh troops. He immediately recognized the situation was hopeless and urged immediate retreat. Nicias, paralyzed by indecision and religious dread, delayed. And that delay transformed disaster into catastrophe. The decision to delay the retreat because of a lunar eclipse has become one of history's most infamous examples of superstition overruling reason. But understanding why Nicias made this catastrophic choice requires understanding the religious worldview that governed ancient Greek military decisions. This wasn't simple cowardice or stupidity, it was the collision between traditional piety and military necessity, and it doomed 40,000 men. Greek armies operated within a complex system of religious observation that modern secular minds struggle to comprehend. No major decision was made without consulting omens, reading sacrifices, and ensuring divine approval. Before battle, priests slaughtered animals and examined their entrails for favourable signs. Birds were observed for direction and species. Dreams were interpreted. Thunder, lightning, and eclipses were messages from the gods that no prudent commander ignored. This wasn't irrational superstition overlaid on otherwise logical military planning. It was the fundamental framework through which Greeks understood causation and fate. Nicias was exceptionally pious even by Greek standards. He had funded lavish religious festivals, dedicated elaborate offerings at temples, and consulted seers before every significant decision. Thucydides, who had limited patience for superstition, described Nicias as too much given to divination and such practices. But for Nicias, this wasn't weakness, it was prudence. The gods controlled outcomes. To ignore their signs was to invite disaster. Better to wait for divine approval than rush forward under ominous portents. On the night of August 27th, 413 BC, as the Athenian army prepared to abandon their fortifications and attempt the desperate overland retreat, the moon entered Earth's shadow. A total lunar eclipse turned the moon blood red, then black, then slowly emerged again. To modern observers, this is a predictable astronomical event. To ancient Greeks, it was terrifying divine intervention. The moon goddess Selene was being devoured. The natural order was suspended. The universe itself was out of balance. The army reacted with panic bordering on hysteria. Men who had faced death in battle trembled at the darkened sky. Rumours spread that the eclipse was a specific warning against their planned retreat, a sign that the gods forbade movement. The soldiers, already demoralised by months of failure, disease and dwindling supplies, seized on the eclipse as explanation for their misfortunes. They had angered the gods. The expedition was cursed. Moving now would only compound divine displeasure. Nicias, faced with an army on the edge of mutiny, and a celestial phenomenon that traditional interpretation deemed catastrophically ominous, consulted the seers and diviners attached to the expedition. These men, professional religious experts whose role was to interpret divine will, consulted their texts and traditions. The standard interpretation of a lunar eclipse was clear. Movement should be delayed for thrice 9 days, 27 days. The gods required a pause. To proceed would be to court divine wrath manifested as military disaster. Demosthenes and other generals pleaded with Nicias to ignore the omen. They argued that the eclipse, if anything, favoured the Athenians by providing cover of darkness for their initial movement. They pointed out that every day of delay gave Syracuse more time to prepare defences and block escape routes. The military situation was deteriorating hourly. Superstition must yield to necessity, but Nicias refused, and his refusal was not entirely unreasonable from his worldview. Consider his logic. The expedition had already suffered inexplicable disasters. The siege that should have succeeded had failed. Gylippus had arrived at the exact moment to save Syracuse. The night assault on Epipolae had descended into chaos. Every decision that seemed militarily sound had resulted in catastrophe. From Nicias's perspective, this wasn't bad luck. It was divine disfavour. The gods opposed the expedition. To ignore their warning now, manifested in the most dramatic celestial omen imaginable, would guarantee destruction. Better to wait, perform appropriate sacrifices, and seek to restore divine favour before moving. Moreover, Nicias faced a command crisis. If he ordered the army to march against the omen and disaster followed, as seemed likely given their situation, he would be blamed for impiety. The soldiers, superstitious and terrified, might refuse to obey. The fleet crews, equally fearful, might mutiny. Nicias's authority, already tenuous, depended on his reputation for piety. To abandon that now would cost him the one source of legitimacy he still possessed. So Nicias ordered the wait. 27 days. The army remained in their fortifications while Syracuse mobilized every resource to prevent their escape. Messengers raced across Sicily rallying reinforcements. Syracusan engineers blocked the mountain passes with fortifications. Cavalry and light infantry positioned themselves along every potential escape route. The rivers were guarded. The roads watched. When the Athenians finally began their retreat on September 9th, they marched not into the unknown, but into a perfectly prepared trap. The eclipse delay transformed a difficult retreat into an impossible one. Had Athens moved immediately, they would have had surprise, relatively clear routes, and Syracuse still scrambling to respond. The 3-day organisational delay Nicias had already imposed was bad enough. The additional 27 days was catastrophic. By the time Athens moved, Syracuse knew exactly where they would go, and had prepared killing grounds at every choke point. Thucydides treated the eclipse delay with barely concealed contempt, but he also understood its significance. The disaster at Syracuse wasn't just military failure, it was the failure of traditional Greek religion to provide useful guidance in crisis. The same religious system that had sustained Greek culture for centuries, that had blessed the victory at Marathon, that had made Sparta's warriors fearless in the face of death, now produced paralysis when boldness was required. The gods, if they existed, had failed to protect their worshippers, or perhaps the worshippers had failed to understand what the gods demanded. In the aftermath, as surviving Athenians languished in the Latomiae or laboured as slaves, many must have reflected on that blood-red moon and wondered whether Nicias had been right or wrong. If they had moved immediately and been destroyed anyway, at least the defeat could be blamed on divine opposition rather than human failure. But they had waited, and the waiting had changed nothing except to make the disaster more complete. The gods remained silent. The moon had emerged from shadow and continued its circuit, and 40,000 men had marched to death while waiting for divine permission to save themselves. On August 27th, 413 BC, under cover of darkness, the Athenian army prepared to move. Then the sky delivered its final judgment. A lunar eclipse occurred, the moon turning blood red as it passed through Earth's shadow. To the superstitious ancient Greeks, eclipses were omens of cosmic significance. Nicias consulted the army's diviners, who declared that the omen forbade any movement for thrice 9 days, 27 days. Demosthenes and other generals pleaded with Nicias to ignore the omen, to march immediately while they still had some element of surprise. Nicias refused. The gods had spoken. They would wait. That decision, born of religious superstition overruling military necessity, was perhaps the single most catastrophic command decision in ancient military history. In the 3 days Athens delayed, Syracuse discovered the planned retreat and mobilized to prevent it. They blocked the mountain passes, fortified the river crossings, and positioned cavalry and light infantry to harass any Athenian movement. When the Athenians finally began their retreat on September the 9th, 413 BC, they marched not toward potential escape but into a meticulously prepared killing ground. 40,000 men formed into a hollow square with the sick and wounded in the centre, began the march inland. They left behind the bodies of hundreds of sick men too weak to travel, men who begged not to be abandoned, men who wept as they watched their comrades march away to certain death, leaving them to slower death at Syracusan hands. The Syracusan cavalry, the same light horsemen who had prevented Athenian foraging for 2 years, now harassed the retreating column from all sides. They rode close, hurled javelins, retreated before the Athenians could respond, then returned to attack again. Light infantry with slings and bows peppered the Athenian formation constantly. Men fell with wounds, were left behind if they could not keep up, and were butchered by pursuing Syracusans. The Athenian advance slowed to a crawl, each mile purchased with lives and exhaustion. They had planned to march north to the allied city of Catana. The route was blocked. They turned south, hoping to reach the coast and possibly steal ships. Every route was contested. Every river crossing became a battle. The Syracusans did not need to defeat the Athenians in pitched combat. They simply needed to bleed them, slow them, and prevent them from reaching water or food. By the 6th day of the retreat, the Athenian force had disintegrated as an organized army. Demosthenes commanded the rear division of about 6,000 men. They had become separated from the main body under Nicias, falling farther behind with each hour. On September 14th, near a place called Irenaeus, Syracusan and allied forces surrounded Demosthenes' division completely. His men were starving, thirst-crazed, exhausted beyond endurance. They formed a defensive formation in an olive grove and prepared to die fighting. The Syracusans offered terms, surrender and live. Demosthenes, the victor of Pylos who had once forced Spartans to surrender, now faced the same choice he had imposed on his enemies. He surrendered. 6,000 Athenian soldiers laid down their arms and were marched off into captivity. Demosthenes himself was taken prisoner, his fate now in Syracusan hands. Nicias, with the remaining forces, continued the desperate march toward the coast. They had no water, no food, and no hope except to somehow reach the sea before they died of thirst. On September 16th they reached the Asinaris River. At the sight of water, discipline collapsed entirely. Men broke ranks and ran for the river, shoving and trampling each other in a desperate rush to drink. They threw themselves into the water face first, gulping desperately, heedless of the Syracusan forces waiting on the opposite bank. Then the slaughter began. Syracusan troops lined the far bank and poured missiles into the Athenians packed in and around the river. Men were struck down while drinking, their blood mixing with the water others desperately drank. Soldiers trying to cross were speared or drowned. The river ran red. Men fought each other for space to drink, killing fellow Athenians in the mad scramble for water. The Syracusans crossed upstream and downstream, encircling the Athenians completely. For hours the massacre continued. Thousands died in the river or on its banks. Some tried to surrender and were killed anyway. Some tried to flee and were run down by cavalry. The Asinaris became a killing field so horrific that even Thucydides, who described battles with clinical detachment, could barely convey its horror. Nicias, watching his army destroyed, personally sought out Gylippus and surrendered. He believed his previous role in negotiating the peace of Nicias would earn him honourable treatment from the Spartan commander. Gylippus accepted the surrender and ordered the killing stopped. Approximately 7,000 Athenian prisoners, all that remained of the 40,000 who had sailed to Sicily 2 years earlier, were herded together and marched back to Syracuse. The greatest military expedition Athens ever launched was annihilated, not defeated in a glorious battle but destroyed through strategic incompetence, superstition, and hubris. The Syracusan assembly debated what to do with the prisoners. Gylippus argued for mercy, or at least for sending the generals to Sparta for propaganda purposes. The Syracusans, remembering the years of siege, the thousands of their own dead, and the arrogance of Athens in attempting to conquer them, voted for vengeance. Nicias and Demosthenes were executed despite Gylippus's protests. The Athenian and allied prisoners were thrown into the Latomiae, the limestone quarries north of Syracuse that had provided stone for the city's construction. The Latomiae were natural prisons, vast open pits carved into bedrock, their walls too sheer to climb, their depths exposed to the elements. 7,000 men were crammed into these stone quarries with almost no food or water. They received a half pint of water and a pint of grain per day. No shelter, no sanitation, no medical care. Men died of wounds, disease, starvation, and despair. Corpses were left to rot among the living. The stench became unbearable. Some went mad. Others died in their sleep. After 70 days of this torture, the Syracusans sold the survivors into slavery. Most Athenians brought about 300 drachmas each. They were branded with the mark of a horse, the symbol of Syracuse literally branded as property of the city they had tried to conquer. A few prisoners gained mercy through an accident of culture. Syracuse loved Greek theatre, particularly the works of Euripides. Some Athenians who could recite passages from Euripides' plays were freed, or at least given better treatment by Syracusans moved by the beauty of his poetry. When these men eventually returned to Athens, they sought out Euripides to thank him. The playwright wept to hear how his words had saved lives in the darkest pits of the Latomiae. It was a small mercy in an ocean of suffering. Athens learned of the disaster in fragments. First came rumours, then confirmation, then the full horrific accounting. The entire expedition was lost, more than 200 ships destroyed or captured, 40,000 men dead, enslaved or missing, the treasury emptied, the flower of Athenian youth, an entire generation of soldiers and sailors, annihilated in Sicily. The assembly sat in stunned silence as messengers recounted the debacle. Then denial turned to rage. How had this happened? Who was responsible? The answers were obvious but unbearable. Athens itself was responsible. The assembly had voted for the expedition. They had ignored Nicias's warnings. They had recalled Alcibiades at the worst possible moment. They had sent reinforcements when they should have cut their losses. Every decision had compounded the disaster until catastrophe became inevitable. The Sicilian expedition was more than a military defeat. It was a revelation of Athens' fundamental strategic bankruptcy. The city had believed its own propaganda about democratic superiority and naval invincibility. It had confused ambition with capacity, confusing wealth with wisdom. The same assembly that produced Pericles had produced the Sicilian disaster, and there was no external enemy to blame. Athens had destroyed itself through hubris, greed, and catastrophic leadership. But the war was not over. Syracuse had defeated Athens, but Sparta still sought Athens' total destruction. The Athenian Empire was wounded, bleeding, vulnerable. Subject cities that had paid tribute for decades now saw opportunity. Sparta, guided by the advice of the traitor Alcibiades and emboldened by the permanent fort at Decilia, prepared to strike the final blows. Athens had survived the plague. It had survived the Archidamian War. Could it survive Sicily? The answer would be written in the blood and ashes of the war's final agonizing chapter. News of the Sicilian catastrophe reached Athens in fragments during the autumn of 413 BC. First came rumours, dismissed as enemy propaganda, then survivor accounts, too consistent to ignore. Finally, official confirmation. The entire expedition was lost, 200 ships destroyed or captured, 40,000 men dead, enslaved or missing. The treasury that had taken decades to accumulate, emptied. An entire generation of Athenian youth, the strongest and most ambitious, annihilated in the quarries of Syracuse or drowned in the waters of the great harbour. The assembly sat in stunned, horrified silence. But there was no time for mourning, no luxury of despair. Sparta's garrison at Decilia, established on Alcibiades' advice, now occupied Attic territory year-round, visible from Athens' walls as a constant reminder of vulnerability. 20,000 slaves, many of them the skilled craftsmen essential to Athens' economy, had fled to Decilia and freedom, the silver mines at Laurium which had funded the fleet that defeated Persia and built the empire, lay abandoned. Every scrap of food, every piece of timber, every necessity had to be imported by sea at crushing expense. The empire that Athens had spent 50 years building was now the only thing keeping Athens alive, and that empire was beginning to crack. Within weeks of Syracuse's fall, rebellions erupted across the Aegean. Euboea, Lesbos, Chios, cities that had paid tribute for half a century, sensed weakness and moved toward independence. They were not acting alone. Behind every rebellion stood a new player in the great game, one with resources that dwarfed anything Greece could muster. Persia. The empire that Athens and Sparta had united to defeat 70 years earlier at Marathon, and Salamis now returned to Greek affairs, and it would determine who won the Peloponnesian War. Persia's involvement transformed everything. King Darius II, ruling from Susa, had watched the Greeks tear each other apart for nearly 20 years with satisfaction. The city-states that had humiliated Persia's invasion forces now exhausted themselves in fratricidal war. But Darius wanted more than Greek weakness. He wanted the reconquest of Ionia, the Greek cities of Asia Minor that Athens had liberated and protected since the Persian Wars. In 412 BC, Darius ordered his satraps, the provincial governors of western Anatolia, to enter the war actively on Sparta's side. Tissaphernes, satrap of Lydia and Caria, and Pharnabazus, satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia, both saw opportunity in the shifting Greek fortunes. They approached Sparta with an offer of staggering implications. Persia would fund the construction and maintenance of a Peloponnesian fleet, capable of challenging Athens at sea. In exchange, Sparta would abandon the Greek cities of Asia Minor to Persian control. For Sparta, this was a devil's bargain. They would betray the very principle they claimed to fight for, Greek independence from barbarian tyranny. But Sparta's leadership, pragmatic and ruthless, accepted immediately. Survival trumped ideology. With Persian gold, Sparta could build the fleet necessary to strangle Athens' maritime lifeline. Without it, the war might drag on another decade with no resolution. The Treaty of Miletus, signed in 412 BC between Sparta and Tissaphernes, formalized the alliance. Persian gold flowed to Spartan shipyards. Triremes that Athens had ruled the seas with for generations now faced a Peloponnesian navy funded by an empire with effectively unlimited resources. The Ionian War, as this final phase of the conflict became known, would be fought not in the olive groves of Attica, but across the Aegean and along the coasts of Asia Minor, a naval war of maneuver, supply lines, and strategic cities. And orchestrating Persia's strategy from behind the scenes was the ghost of Athens' own ambition, ALCIBIADES. ALCIBIADES' journey from Athens' greatest advocate of Sicilian conquest to advisor to both Sparta and Persia represented one of the most remarkable political careers in history. After advising Sparta to fortify Decilia and send Gylippus to Syracuse, Alcibiades had made himself indispensable to King Agis, but his personal life proved his undoing. While Agis campaigned with the army at Decilia, Alcibiades seduced Queen Timea. When she became pregnant, she publicly declared the child was Alcibiades, not a cuckold's bastard, but proudly Alcibiades' son. The scandal was spectacular even by Alcibiades' standards. Agis, enraged and humiliated, ordered Alcibiades' assassination. Warned of the plot, Alcibiades fled Sparta in 412 BC and made his way to Sardis, the seat of Tissaphernes' power. Through sheer force of personality and political brilliance, Alcibiades convinced the Persian satrap that backing Sparta to total victory would be a strategic error. If Sparta destroyed Athens completely, Sparta would become the dominant Greek power and a potential threat to Persian interests. Better to keep Athens and Sparta balanced, weakening both, while Persia regained Ionia and positioned itself as the arbiter of Greek affairs. Tissaphernes found this argument compelling. He reduced financial support to Sparta, providing just enough to keep the war going, but not enough to deliver decisive victory. It was classic Persian strategy: divide and rule. But Alcibiades was playing an even deeper game. From Tissaphernes' court, he sent secret messages to the Athenian fleet stationed at Samos, the forward base for Aegean operations. He claimed he could bring Persia over to Athens' side, providing the gold and ships necessary to turn the war around. There was one condition: Athens must abandon democracy and establish an oligarchy. Tissaphernes, Alcibiades claimed, would never ally with a democracy, but would work with a stable oligarchic government. It was a lie, but a believable one, and desperate men believe convenient lies. In Athens, a conspiracy formed. Wealthy conservatives who had always resented democracy saw opportunity in catastrophe. They argued that democracy had produced the Sicilian disaster, that the assembly mob was incapable of making sound strategic decisions, that Athens needed rule by the competent few rather than the ignorant many. Working in coordination with Alcibiades and sympathetic officers in the fleet, they orchestrated a coup. Through a campaign of intimidation, assassination, and parliamentary manipulation, the oligarchic faction seized control of Athens in June 411 BC and established a new government, the Council of the 400. The 400 were not a legislative body but a self-appointed junta. They claimed to represent a broader group of 5,000 citizens of sufficient wealth and status to deserve political rights, but the 5,000 was a fiction. Real power belonged to 400 oligarchs who met in secret, made decisions without transparency, and ruled through fear. They immediately opened peace. Negotiations with Sparta, prepared to surrender on humiliating terms that would preserve their own power while abandoning the empire. They began constructing a fort in Piraeus harbour, ostensibly for defence but actually to provide Spartan forces access to Athens if the population resisted oligarchic rule. But the oligarchs had miscalculated fatally. The Athenian fleet at Samos, the only intact military force Athens still possessed, was composed of citizens who had no intention of abandoning democracy. When news of the coup reached Samos, the sailors mutinied against oligarchic officers, executed or imprisoned the coup's supporters, and declared themselves the legitimate government of Athens. They elected new generals, swore an oath to defend democracy, and prepared to sail to Athens to overthrow the 400 by force. The Peloponnesian War had produced a new horror. Athens was on the verge of civil war, its fleet and city ready to fight each other while Sparta watched. Into this chaos sailed Alcibiades. The fleet at Samos, needing leadership and believing Alcibiades could deliver Persian support, elected him general. Alcibiades accepted, then did something extraordinary. He prevented the fleet from sailing against Athens. He argued that Athens at war with itself would guarantee Spartan victory. Instead, the fleet should remain at Samos, defending Athens' interests in the Aegean while allowing the political situation at home to resolve itself. It was, perhaps, the only moment in Alcibiades' career where personal ambition aligned with Athenian interests. The fleet stayed at Samos. Civil war was averted. Barely. In Athens, the 400 collapsed from internal contradictions. Moderates within the oligarchy, led by a politician named Theramenes, grew alarmed at the extremist willingness to surrender to Sparta. When one of the extremist leaders, Phrynichus, was assassinated in broad daylight, popular rage erupted. The hoplites in Piraeus, citizens with armour and weapons, tore down the fort that the 400 had been constructing to admit Spartan forces. Faced with armed resistance, the 400 dissolved. Power passed briefly to the 5,000, a broader but still oligarchic government. Then in 410 BC, democracy was fully restored. Athens had survived dictatorship, but the months of political chaos had wasted precious time and resources while Sparta consolidated gains across the Aegean. The restoration of democracy coincided with desperately needed military successes. Under Alcibiades' command, the fleet at Samos began winning battles that demonstrated Athens still possessed formidable naval skill. At Cynossema, in 411 BC, Athenian forces defeated a larger Peloponnesian fleet through superior tactics and seamanship. At Abydos, they won again. At Cyzicus in 410 BC, Alcibiades achieved a stunning victory, destroying the entire Peloponnesian fleet under the Spartan Narvok Mindarus. The Spartan message back to Sparta intercepted by Athens read simply, "Ships lost, Mindarus dead, men starving, what to do?" For a brief shining moment, Athens believed it might still win this war. Sparta, shaken by the disaster at Cyzicus, offered peace. They proposed restoring the status quo ante bellum. Both sides keep what they currently held. Prisoners exchanged, hostilities ceased. The Spartan garrison would evacuate Decelia. It was a generous offer, perhaps the best terms Athens would see. But the assembly, emboldened by recent victories and urged on by the demagogue Cleophon, rejected peace. Athens would accept nothing less than complete restoration of its pre-war empire. The vote to reject Sparta's peace offer may have been the single most catastrophic decision Athens made in the entire war. It guaranteed the conflict would continue until one side achieved total victory, and Athens, for all its recent successes, was bleeding to death economically and demographically. The war ground on, year after year, in a series of naval engagements across the Aegean and Hellespont. Cities changed hands: Chalcedon, Byzantium, Selymbria. Alcibiades, commanding the fleet with a freedom no Athenian general had enjoyed since Pericles, won victory after victory. He recaptured Byzantium, controlling the Bosporus and Athens' grain supply from the Black Sea. He sailed along the Ionian coast, reasserting Athenian authority over wavering allies. In 407 BC, crowned with success and believing his past treason would be forgiven in light of recent triumphs, Alcibiades returned to Athens for the first time since his defection to Sparta. His reception was spectacular. The assembly overturned his conviction, restored his confiscated property, and elected him supreme commander of all Athenian forces with unprecedented powers. Priests who had cursed him for sacrilege now removed the curses. He sailed from Piraeus with a fleet of 100 ships, accompanied by cavalry and hoplites, given resources and authority to finish the war. But Alcibiades' greatest weakness was always Alcibiades. Success made him arrogant, and arrogance made him careless. While Alcibiades was absent from the fleet conducting a minor operation, he left his helmsman Antiochus in command with explicit orders not to engage the enemy. Antiochus, eager to prove himself, attacked the Spartan fleet at Notium and was defeated. Athenian losses were modest, only 15 ships, but the political damage was immense. Alcibiades' enemies in Athens, waiting for any opportunity to bring him down, accused him of negligence and incompetence. The assembly, as fickle as ever, refused to re-elect him as general. Alcibiades, knowing what awaited political losers in Athens, fled rather than return home. He retired to a fortress he owned in the Thracian Chersonese, removed from the war but watching as Athens staggered toward its final catastrophe. The new Spartan naval commander was a man who would prove himself Athens' nemesis, Lysander. Unlike previous Spartan admirals who served for limited terms, Lysander maintained his position through legal fictions and political maneuvering, providing Sparta with consistent naval leadership for the first time. Lysander was brilliant, ruthless, and politically astute. He cultivated personal relationships with Persian princes, particularly Cyrus the Younger, son of King Darius II, who'd been sent to Asia Minor with authority over the western satrapies. Cyrus provided Lysander with generous funding, more than Tissaphernes had ever offered. With Persian gold, Lysander expanded the Peloponnesian fleet, raided Athenian supply lines, and prepared for a decisive confrontation. Athens, meanwhile, faced resource exhaustion on a scale that no amount of strategic brilliance could overcome. The treasury was empty. The fleet required constant maintenance and wages for rowers. The population needed food imported from the Black Sea and Egypt. Subject cities, sensing Athens' desperation, withheld tribute or rebelled outright. Athens melted down gold dedications from the Acropolis, stripping the temples to fund the war. They even melted gold from the statue of Nike to mint coins. Every decision was made under the shadow of survival, and every decision mortgaged the future to sustain the present. In 406 BC, Athens scraped together enough resources to man 110 ships for an operation to relieve Conon, one of their best admirals, who was trapped by a Spartan fleet at Mytilene on Lesbos. The Spartan commander Callicratidas had 170 ships. The odds favoured Sparta, but Athens had experience and desperation. The fleets met near the ARCHIDAMIAN Islands in August 406 BC. The battle was savage and confused, fought in choppy seas that made manoeuvring difficult. But Athenian skill prevailed. They destroyed 70 Spartan ships, killed Callicratidas, and forced the Peloponnesian fleet to retreat. It was Athens' last great naval victory, and it led directly to one of the most shameful episodes in Athenian history. During the battle, 25 Athenian ships were sunk or crippled. Hundreds of sailors clung to wreckage or swam desperately in the rough seas. The Athenian commanders dispatched triarchs' ship captains to rescue the survivors while the main fleet pursued the retreating Spartans. But a storm blew up. The seas became impossible, and the rescue effort failed. Thousands of Athenian sailors drowned within sight of their own fleet. When the 8 commanding generals returned to Athens expecting celebration for their victory, they instead faced trial for abandoning the survivors. The trial of the generals after Arginusae revealed how far Athens had fallen from the reasoned discourse of Pericles' era. The assembly, whipped into a frenzy by demagogues and grieving families, demanded vengeance. The generals were tried collectively, in violation of Athenian law requiring individual trials. Socrates, serving as epistates presiding over the assembly, that day refused to put the illegal motion to a vote. He was overruled by mob intimidation. The assembly voted to execute all 8 generals. 2 had fled, but the remaining 6, including Pericles' own son, were executed. Athens had killed its own victorious commanders for a failed rescue attempt during a storm they could not control. The trial and execution of the 6 generals after Arginusae represents democracy at its absolute worst: mob emotion, overruling law, grief superseding reason, and political theatre ending in judicial murder. But it wasn't simply an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a democratic system stressed beyond its capacity, corrupted by war, and manipulated by demagogues who understood how to weaponize grief. The facts were straightforward. After defeating the Spartan fleet near the Arginusae Islands in August 406 BC, 8 Athenian generals faced a deteriorating sea state. 25 Athenian ships had been sunk or crippled. Hundreds of sailors clung to wreckage or swam desperately in increasingly rough seas. The generals dispatched junior officers, the triarchs, to conduct rescue operations while the main fleet pursued the retreating Spartans. But a sudden storm made rescue impossible. The triarchs, unable to navigate safely in the violent seas, abandoned the rescue attempt. When they returned to the main fleet and reported failure, it was too late. Hundreds, possibly thousands of Athenian citizens had drowned. When news reached Athens, grief exploded into rage. The families of the dead demanded accountability. How could Athens win a great victory yet leave its own citizens to drown? Someone must be responsible. Someone must pay. The generals returning to Athens expecting celebrations instead faced criminal charges. The accusation was clear. They had abandoned the rescue attempt, either through incompetence or callous disregard for citizen lives, and must answer for those deaths. The legal process that followed violated virtually every protection Athenian law provided. The generals were to be tried collectively rather than individually, despite Athenian law requiring separate trials for each accused. The assembly would vote on their guilt directly, rather than using the jury courts designed for criminal trials. There would be minimal time for defense. The entire process was rushed, driven by emotion rather than deliberation. Some generals had already fled Athens, recognizing the political climate made fair trial impossible. 6 remained: Pericles the Younger, son of the great Pericles, Diomedon, Lysias, Aristocrates, Thrasyllus, and Erasinides. These were experienced commanders, men who had fought for Athens for years. Pericles the Younger carried the most famous name in Athenian history. None of it mattered. The demagogues orchestrating the prosecution understood mob psychology perfectly. They packed the assembly with grieving families. They presented heart-wrenching testimony from survivors who claimed they had called out to passing ships that ignored them. They argued that the generals had prioritized plundering enemy wrecks over saving Athenian lives, choosing profit over duty. None of this was true, but truth was irrelevant. The assembly was a sea of grief seeking a target. The generals attempted to defend themselves, explaining that the storm had made rescue impossible, that they had ordered rescue attempts that were thwarted by weather beyond anyone's control. That blaming commanders for a natural disaster was unjust. They called witnesses who confirmed the storm's severity, but the prosecutors countered with emotional appeals. If the storm was so severe, why did some men survive? Clearly rescue was possible, and the generals chose not to attempt it. On the day of the vote, Socrates was serving as one of the prytanes, the rotating executives of the Council of 500, and specifically as the epistates, the single official presiding over that day's assembly. When the motion to vote collectively on all 6 generals came forward, Socrates recognized it as illegal. He refused to put the measure to a vote. The assembly, furious, threatened Socrates himself with prosecution. Other prytanes urged him to comply. The mob demanded blood. Socrates held firm. For hours the assembly raged. Finally, the other prytanes moved to override Socrates and held the vote without him. Socrates' principled stand delayed proceedings but could not stop them. The assembly voted overwhelmingly to execute all 6 generals. No appeal, no clemency, immediate execution. Pericles the Younger died first. The son of Athens' greatest statesman, the man who had guided the city through the plague and the early war, was executed for a rescue failure during a storm. The other 5 followed. Within days of Athens' last great naval victory, 6 of its most experienced naval commanders were dead by their own city's hand. The aftermath was immediate and catastrophic. Every surviving Athenian general now understood that victory provided no protection from political prosecution. Any operation that involved casualties, any decision that could be second-guessed by assembly demagogues, risked execution. The logical response was extreme caution. Avoid battle, avoid risk, avoid command if possible. Athens had just eliminated the aggressive, bold leadership it desperately needed in the war's final year. Within months, the assembly that had executed the generals came to regret it. The demagogues who had orchestrated the prosecution were themselves prosecuted for misleading the people. Some were executed, others fled. The assembly passed decrees honouring the executed generals and providing compensation to their families. But apologies didn't resurrect the dead or restore the experience Athens had destroyed. The UNEASY trial revealed democracy's darkest potential. The same system that had produced Pericles' brilliance and Athens' cultural flowering could, under stress, become a lynch mob. The assembly that debated philosophy and funded the greatest art of the ancient world could also murder its own heroes in fits of grief-driven rage. Democracy without institutional protections against mob emotion, without enforced legal procedures, without cooling mechanisms to slow, passion-driven decisions, could be as tyrannical as any dictatorship. Plato, Socrates' student, watched this trial and drew conclusions about democracy that would shape Western political philosophy for millennia. How could government by the people be just when the people could be manipulated by demagogues into committing obvious injustice? How could popular sovereignty be trusted when it produced outcomes like UNEASY? The execution of the generals became Exhibit A in the philosophical case against democratic government. But the immediate impact was simpler and more brutal. Athens, facing final defeat, had just killed 6 of the commanders who might have prevented it. When Lysander trapped the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami the following year, the aggressive, risk-taking generals who might have avoided the disaster were dead, executed by the city they had fought to save. The democracy had devoured its own champions, and within months it would pay the price in total defeat. The execution of the Arginacei generals was more than judicial murder. It was strategic suicide. Athens had just eliminated 6 of its most experienced naval commanders at a moment when experience was the only advantage it retained over Sparta's better-funded fleet. Moreover, the trial sent a message to every surviving Athenian commander. Victory would not protect you from popular rage if anything went wrong. Better to avoid battle, avoid risk, avoid responsibility. This psychological impact was catastrophic. When Athens needed bold, aggressive leadership in the war's final year, its commanders were paralyzed by fear of their own government. Lysander returned to command of the Spartan fleet through a legal fiction that appointed him as vice-admiral under a nominal superior, recognized Athens' vulnerability. In 405 BC, with Cyrus providing lavish funding, Lysander assembled a fleet of 170 ships at Lampsacus on the Asian shore of the Hellespont. His target was clear: sever Athens' grain supply from the Black Sea. Every year, massive grain ships sailed from the Bosporus through the Hellespont to Piraeus. Without that grain, Athens would starve. The Athenian fleet, 180 ships carrying 36,000 men, pursued Lysander north. The Athenian fleet anchored at Aegospotami, Goats Rivers, on the European shore of the Hellespont opposite Lampsacus. It was a terrible position. The beach offered no harbour, no city for supplies, no fortifications. Every day the Athenians rowed across the strait and formed battle formation, challenging Lysander to fight. Every day Lysander kept his ships in Lampsacus harbour and refused engagement. After hours of waiting, the Athenians would row back to Aegospotami, beach their ships, and scatter to forage for food in the surrounding countryside. This pattern repeated for 4 days. Alcibiades, watching from his nearby fortress, recognized the disaster developing. He rode to the Athenian camp and warned the generals that their position was untenable. They should move to Sestos, a fortified city with a proper harbour where the fleet could be protected and supplied. The generals, remembering Alcibiades' fall from grace after Notium, dismissed his advice with contempt. Alcibiades left, knowing what was coming and unable to prevent it. On the 5th day, the Athenians rowed across, formed their challenge formation, were ignored by Lysander and returned to Aegospotami. They beached their ships and scattered to forage as usual. But Lysander had been waiting for exactly this moment. He had sent scouts to observe the Athenian pattern and signal when the fleet was most vulnerable. When the signal came that the Athenians were dispersed and their ships unmanned, Lysander launched every ship simultaneously. The Spartan fleet crossed the strait at ramming speed and hit the Athenian position like an avalanche. The Athenians had no warning, no time to organize resistance, no possibility of escape. Most ships were still beached and unmanned. Some crews tried desperately to launch their vessels. They were rammed or boarded before they reached deep water. A few ships with skeleton crews tried to flee along the coast. Lysander's faster, fully manned vessels ran them down. Within hours, it was over. 170 Athenian triremes were captured or destroyed. Only 9 ships escaped, fleeing north. Among them was the state trireme Pericles, which raced to Athens to bring news of total annihilation. 36,000 Athenian sailors and soldiers were killed or captured. Lysander ordered the prisoners assembled. Among them were the captured Athenian generals and triarchs. Lysander held a quick trial, or mockery of one. The Athenians were condemned for war crimes, executing Corinthian and Andrian prisoners earlier in the war, throwing Spartan prisoners overboard, cutting off the thumbs of captured sailors. 3,000 Athenian prisoners were executed. The rest were sold into slavery. Lysander had not merely defeated Athens' fleet, he had exterminated it. Athens no longer possessed a navy, no means of importing food, no way to resist, and no hope of survival. The Pericles arrived at Piraeus at night. As news of Aegospotami spread through Athens, a wail of lamentation rose from the city, spreading from the Piraeus through the long walls to Athens itself, person to person, family to family, until the entire city mourned. They mourned not just the dead, but their own coming fate. Everyone understood what Aegospotami meant. The war was lost. Sparta would show no mercy. Athens, the city that had executed prisoners, destroyed cities and enslaved populations, would receive the same treatment it had inflicted on others. The assembly met in emergency session and voted to prepare for siege, knowing preparation was futile. Lysander methodically sailed around the Aegean, recalling Athenian garrisons, installing pro-Spartan oligarchies in former Athenian subject cities, and gathering his fleet for the final operation. He arrived at Piraeus in the autumn of 405 BC with a fleet of 150 ships and established a complete naval blockade. Simultaneously, the Spartan kings Agis and Pausanias led armies into Attica from Decilia and encamped outside Athens' walls. The city was surrounded by land and sea, cut off from all supplies, sentenced to starvation. Athens held out through the winter of 405 to 404 BC, hoping desperately for salvation that would never come. Persia would not intervene. Cyrus supported Sparta. The subject cities would not rebel in Athens' favour. They celebrated liberation from Athenian imperialism. No relief force existed anywhere in Greece. As winter turned to spring, food supplies dwindled, then vanished. Athenians began starving. Bodies accumulated in the streets. Desperate proposals circulated: surrender unconditionally, fight to the death, evacuate the entire population to a colony abroad. Nothing was feasible. Sparta controlled the sea. Athens could not escape, could not fight, and could not survive. In April 404 BC, Athens sent envoys to Sparta to negotiate surrender. The Spartan assembly debated Athens' fate. Corinth and Thebes, remembering decades of rivalry and Athenian arrogance, demanded Athens be destroyed completely. The city should be razed, the population enslaved or executed, the very name of Athens erased from history. It was the same fate Athens had inflicted on Melos and contemplated for Mytilene. But Sparta surprisingly showed restraint. The Spartan leadership argued that Athens had saved Greece during the Persian Wars. For that ancient service, Athens deserved to survive, though in broken form. Sparta would dictate terms that ensured Athens could never threaten Peloponnesian supremacy again, but the city would live. The terms of surrender were harsh, but not genocidal. Athens would demolish the long walls connecting the city to Piraeus, the fortifications that had made Athens impregnable to land attack for half a century. Athens would surrender all but 12 ships, reducing the greatest naval power in Greek history to coastal patrol capability. Athens would recall all exiles, primarily oligarchic sympathizers Sparta could rely on to install a friendly government. Athens would become a member of the Peloponnesian League, subordinate to Sparta, obligated to follow Sparta's foreign policy. The Athenian Empire was dissolved, its subject cities liberated or transferred to Spartan control. Athens accepted all terms. There was no alternative. In April 404 BC, to the music of flute girls and amid celebration by Sparta's allies, the long walls were demolished. Lysander oversaw the destruction personally, ensuring every stone was pulled down. The walls had symbolized Athenian power, Pericles' strategy, the confidence that Athens could outlast any siege sustained by its navy and empire. Now they fell, and with them fell every assumption that had driven Athenian policy for 50 years. When the last section collapsed, Sparta's allies declared it the first day of freedom for Greece. For Athens, it was the end of everything. Lysander installed a puppet government in Athens, the 30 tyrants, oligarchs who ruled through Spartan military support and terror. They executed or exiled thousands of democratic supporters, confiscated property, and governed with a brutality that made the 400 seem moderate. The Democrats fought back, beginning a civil war that would rage for a year before democracy was restored with Sparta's grudging acceptance. But even restored, Athens would never be the same. The city that had led Greece against Persia, that had created the Delian League and ruled an empire spanning hundreds of cities, that had produced Pericles, Socrates, and the glory of the Golden Age, was reduced to a second-rate power living in Sparta's shadow. The human cost of the Peloponnesian War defied comprehension. At least 150,000 Greeks died in combat, from disease, from famine, or in captivity. Entire cities were destroyed: Plataea, Melos, Sione, cities whose populations were executed or enslaved. Populations were displaced, economies ruined, social structures shattered. Athens lost perhaps 2/3 of its adult male citizen population over the war's 27 years. Sparta, despite victory, emerged hollow. The Spartiates, never numerous, had been ground down by constant warfare. Their economy, always dependent on helot labour, was strained past breaking. The moral authority Sparta claimed in liberating Greece from Athenian tyranny evaporated as they imposed oligarchies and collected tribute as ruthlessly as Athens ever had. Greece itself was broken. The Persian Empire, playing Athens and Sparta against each other while funding both sides, emerged as the real winner. Within a generation, Persia would dominate Greek affairs, dictating peace terms and treating the independent city-states as client kingdoms. The dream of Greek unity that had briefly existed during the Persian Wars was dead. The cultural and intellectual flowering of 5th century Athens ended. philosophy, drama, and democracy continued, but in diminished form, shadows of the Golden Age's brilliance. The Peloponnesian War did not merely change which city-state dominated Greece, it ended the era when Greece dominated anything. Thucydides, writing in exile, chronicled the war not as a story of heroes, but as a case study in human nature, power, and the inevitability of conflict between rising and established powers. His history became immortal because the lessons remained eternally relevant. Nations driven by fear, honour and self-interest will make decisions that lead to catastrophic wars even when both sides understand the likely costs. Leaders will prioritise short-term political survival over long-term strategic wisdom. Democracies can be as brutal and irrational as tyrannies when fear and ambition override judgment. The Peloponnesian War was not an ancient curiosity, but a template for understanding every great power conflict that followed. The saviours of Greece had destroyed each other exactly as Thucydides predicted they would. Athens, driven by ambition and belief in its own exceptional destiny, overextended and collapsed. Sparta, driven by fear of encirclement and change, won a war that left it exhausted and morally bankrupt. The war that both sides entered believing they could win quickly and decisively became a generational nightmare that consumed everything it touched. And when it finally ended after 27 years of slaughter, neither victor nor vanquished had gained anything worth the price paid. The ruins of Athens and the Pyrrhic triumph of Sparta stood as monuments to the brutal truth: in war even the winners lose. 27 years, an entire generation consumed by war. The Greeks who celebrated victory over Persia at Salamis lived to see their sons and grandsons slaughter each other in Sicily, in the Aegean, in the streets of their own cities. The alliance that saved Western civilization at Thermopylae became the instrument of its own destruction at Aegospotami. This is the brutal truth of the Peloponnesian War. There were no heroes, only victims of ambition, fear, and pride. Athens fell not because Sparta was stronger, but because Athens destroyed itself. The democracy that produced Pericles also produced the Sicilian Expedition. The assembly that built the Parthenon also executed the generals of our UNEASY. The same people who voted to spare Mytilene from genocide voted to exterminate the population of Melos. Athens' greatest strength, its democratic system that engaged every citizen in governance, became its fatal weakness when mob emotion replaced strategic wisdom. The city that claimed to be the school of Hellas taught the world how empires collapse under the weight of their own hubris. Sparta won the war and lost everything that mattered. They fought, they claimed, to liberate Greece from Athenian tyranny. Yet within years of victory, Sparta imposed harsher control over Greek cities than Athens ever had. They betrayed the Ionian Greeks to Persia, the very cities they had fought to protect during the Persian Wars, selling them for Persian gold to build the fleet that defeated Athens. The Spartan citizens who prided themselves on honour and martial virtue became enforcers of oligarchic terror, propping up the 30 tyrants in Athens while Greek democracy drowned in blood. Lysander's triumph lasted barely a decade before Sparta itself faced rebellions, invasions, and the same imperial overreach that had destroyed Athens. And what of the men who shaped this catastrophe? Pericles, the architect of Athenian strategy, died of plague watching his city descend into chaos, his grand vision of outlasting Sparta collapsing around him. Alcibiades, the brilliant traitor who served Athens, Sparta, and Persia with equal enthusiasm and equal betrayal, was assassinated in Phrygia in 404 BC. burned alive in a house surrounded by Persian agents, his extraordinary talents finally exhausted. Nicias, the cautious general who never wanted the Sicilian command, was executed by the very Syracusans he had hoped to negotiate with, his piety and caution rewarded with a spear thrust. Brasidas, Sparta's most innovative commander, died at Amphipolis achieving victory but never seeing the final triumph his strategies enabled. Lysander, Sparta's greatest naval commander, was killed in 395 BC fighting Thebes in yet another Greek civil war, his victory over Athens already crumbling into new conflicts. The true victor of the Peloponnesian War was Persia, the empire that Greece had united to defeat in 480 BC, became the arbiter of Greek affairs by 404 BC. Persian gold decided which Greek city would dominate. Persian satraps dictated terms of peace treaties. Within 30 years of Athens' surrender, Sparta would sign the King's Peace, formally ceding all Greek cities in Asia Minor to Persian control and accepting Persian mediation in Greek disputes. The independence that Greeks had bled for at Marathon, Thermopylae and Salamis was sold by Sparta for the silver needed to defeat Athens. The saviours of Greece had not only destroyed each other, they had surrendered Greek freedom to the very empire they had once driven back. But the Peloponnesian War's legacy extends far beyond ancient Greece. Thucydides wrote his history believing that human nature remains constant, that the same patterns of fear, honour and interest that drove Athens and Sparta to war would drive future powers to similar conflicts. He was right. The Peloponnesian War became the template for understanding great power competition, the dangers of rapid rise threatening established hegemonies, the security dilemmas that make war seem rational even when it leads to mutual destruction. Every empire that overextends, every democracy that lets emotion override strategy, every alliance that fractures under the pressure of conflicting interests, echoes the dynamics Thucydides documented in 5th century Greece. The physical city of Athens survived, and within decades, its intellectual life revived. Plato and Aristotle would walk the same streets where the plague victims rotted. The Academy and the Lyceum would teach philosophy in the shadow of the Acropolis where the gold statue of Athena has been melted for war funds. But the political Athens, the imperial democracy that dominated the Aegean and challenged the greatest land power in Greece, never returned. The walls were eventually rebuilt, the democracy restored, but the confidence, the boundless ambition, the belief in Athenian exceptionalism that had driven the Golden Age was gone forever, buried in the quarries of Syracuse and drowned in the waters off Aegospotami. Sparta's victory was even more hollow. The Spartan system, always fragile and dependent on brutal subjugation of the Helots, could not sustain empire. Within a generation, Thebes would defeat Sparta at Leuctra in 371 BC, killing one of Sparta's kings and shattering the myth of Spartan invincibility. The Spartiates, never numerous, declined to critically low numbers. The rigid agoge system that produced legendary warriors proved incapable of adapting to changing military technology and tactics. By the time Philip II of Macedon unified Greece under Macedonian hegemony in the mid-4th century, Sparta was a relic, clinging to ancient glories while the Greek world moved on without them. The Peloponnesian War teaches us that victory in war is not always worth the cost of winning. Athens and Sparta both achieved military objectives. Athens built an empire, Sparta destroyed it. But the empire Athens built became the instrument of its destruction, and the victory Sparta won exhausted its society beyond recovery. The war that both sides entered believing they could control spiraled into total war that consumed everything: economies, populations, moral restraints, and ultimately the very independence both fought to preserve. It is a lesson every generation must relearn in blood, that wars begun for limited objectives can become existential struggles, where survival trumps all other values, and survival purchased at too high a price is indistinguishable from defeat. This is the brutal truth of the Peloponnesian War. Not a glorious contest of heroes, but a tragedy of human limitation. Athens and Sparta, the cities that stood together against impossible odds at Thermopylae and Salamis, tore each other apart because neither could accept sharing Greece with an equal. The war was not inevitable because of geography or economics, but because of human nature. The fear of decline, the honour that forbids compromise, the ambition that sees opportunity in others' weakness. Thucydides identified these forces 2,400 years ago, and they remain with us today, driving nations toward conflicts they claim not to want, but seem incapable of avoiding. The saviours of Greece destroyed each other because they forgot the lesson that defeating Persia should have taught them, that unity is strength, that division is death, and that the greatest threat to any civilization is not external enemies, but internal fractures that enemies can exploit. Athens and Sparta had the power to rule Greece together, to maintain the alliance that defeated the greatest empire on earth. Instead, they chose war, and that choice cost them everything. Stand on the Pnyx in Athens today, where the assembly once met, and you can still see the Acropolis rising above the city. The Parthenon still stands, scarred by time and war but enduring. Walk through Syracuse and you can visit the Latomiae, the stone quarries where 7,000 Athenians died in captivity. The stones themselves bear witness to the cost of hubris. These places remain as monuments to one of history's greatest cautionary tales, that power without wisdom leads to ruin, that democracies can be as destructive as tyrannies, and that wars fought to defend freedom can end by destroying it. The Peloponnesian War ended in 404 BC, but its lessons are eternal. We live in a world of rising and established powers, of security dilemmas and alliance politics, of democratic nations claiming moral superiority while committing strategic atrocities. The technology changes, the scale changes, but human nature, the fear and honour and interest that Thucydides identified as the drivers of conflict, remains constant, until we learn the lesson that Athens and Sparta paid 27 years and hundreds of thousands of lives to teach. We are doomed to repeat their tragedy in new forms, with new weapons, in new theatres, but always with the same brutal truth. In war, even the winners lose. This has been the complete story of the Peloponnesian War, how the saviours of Greece became its destroyers. If this deep dive into ancient history's most brutal conflict moved you, if you want to support more comprehensive historical content like this, please consider supporting Wars in History on Ko-fi. Your donations directly fund the research, writing, and production that brings these epic historical narratives to life. The link is in the description below. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us continue bringing you the unfiltered, brutal truth of military history. Thank you for watching, and remember, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Until next time, warriors of history.